enterprise is to get back into this pre-predicative experience. This is what we've lost. This is the forgottenness. You know, we have lost the experiential. And the Germans have two words for experience, Erlebnis and Erfahrung.
Relieveness?
Erlebnis, lived experience. And then the experience and judgment. This is more, yeah. It has some connection to judgment. So this is a non-prejudice, and this is what Sartre uses as lived experience, vécu in French, right? Vécu. Yeah. Right? So the pre-predicative experience is really what is trying to be sprung forth. So the goal of phenomenology, again, going back even further, right, is the Wesen schauen, the return to, and again, the things, but even more so, themselves, right? Themselves, right? Not only the things as objectification, right, as objects in the world, but the thing as a thing that we can experience, if you will, right? Right? So in a way, the phenomenological moment or phenomenology itself is the study of phenomena as it springs forth, emerges in the world. Now you use the word river. I mean, Freud got from the pastor, I think it was Oscar Pfister was his name, the oceanic feeling. So that's another thing too that was going on that was related to religion in a way as a sublime, the oceanic. So the river is maybe one moment here. Mark Bloch uses the metaphor. I mean, not Mark Bloch, excuse me. Ernst Bloch uses the metaphor.
Yeah. That's interesting. That's a good point. Yeah.
Uses the metaphor of the river, the streams. Right?
That's amazing. I could tell already.
The rhyme, you know.
Yeah. You had to go to John Talon for that, to the market.
Where'd you get it? Oh, I'm from Canada.
Montreal. So, again, the Wesen schauen is the return to the things themselves. Now, with Kant, right, Heidegger has a seminar on something that is called Was ist das Ding? What is called the thing? What is the thing? Right?
Okay.
Right? Okay? So the Kantian problematics was that you have these realms, right? The noumenal,
This is the Kantian.
yes.
Okay.
And then the phenomenal, right? The phenomenal realm and the noumenal, right? Phenomena and the noumenal.
What's the new?
The noumena was stuff like an X. We don't really grasp it. We never really capture the noumena.
And we can never
That comes
capture
from the Greek word nous, which was, in Aristotle, kind of a, material that we, just always are working with. It's like matter that we don't have any form for, right? It never really phenomenalizes. So he splits, right, very early on, the phenomenal world from the noumenal. Okay? And this becomes for Kant, that you can only think in terms of the accompaniment of your representations, right? Never really a pure presentation, right? Is going on, yeah? It's always, the prefix is always already there. I think while I accompany all my representations.
Okay.
Okay? So what they're trying to get away from, obviously, is this type of representational thinking,
Right.
which is also connected, if you will, to technology
Right.
as technique, right? We're always, and scientific inquiry that's always representing something, right? Because scientific inquiry is not going back to this pre-predicative experience. I'm trying to, hopefully this is elucidating to you some of the project that they're involved in, right? They meaning Husserl,
Right.
Heidegger with much
Sure.
more the emphasis on the circle of language and the emphasis upon language. Husserl more on the scientific project of getting to the things themselves, right, through consciousness. So you have this thing that goes on, I mean, well, I'm saying thing anyway, consciousness, Bewusstsein, right, and you also have being. So for Husserl, it's the consciousness and the intentionality of consciousness that is always capable in the self-reflexive activity of trying to get back to pre-predicative experience. Yeah, and the self-reflexivity, reflection upon the self-reflexivity, right, in which we go through many, many levels of egological regions where we begin to see things in these layers, right, going forward, right, and we begin to intend an object. You know, there are many good studies about music and retention and memory, right, primary and secondary retention. And tertiary.
That's Husserl.
And Husserl, of which Stiegler takes
Yeah.
up very interestingly in his work. You know, so a good example of this in the jazz world, at least to my mind, would be, you know, Charlie Parker always carried a phonograph with Lester Young records. So he's always repeating that primary retention, right, that ultimately becomes part of his music. Right?
Of a secondary retention.
The secondary retention, right? It becomes tertiary, that ultimately goes all the way back to this, but more to this, to the thing themselves, right? So they have all kinds of moments within this, you know, very, very long. But the real attempt here was by the phenomenologists against Kant was to say we can grasp the thing itself, right? We can grasp ultimately, right? This new emerald, right? We can phenomenalize it. We can see it. We can understand this through consciousness. Right? In Husserl, right? Whereas in Heidegger, it's being and language, and that's so much an emphasis by Husserl on the language, right? And language is very important for the leap because you come in to the meaning, right? Remember the fundamental questions. We've forgotten, right? And we don't know what it means to be. You know, remember in the beginning, he talks about, you know, the perplexity, as you pointed out earlier with Schurman, right? Is in the beginning, you know, now we have become perplexed. And that perplexity is really the perplexity of the pre-predicative experiential level, right? And experience in Greek, by the way, experi, means danger. We're usually afraid, I mean, this is, you know, kind of leading up to today's, you know, we're usually afraid of experience because it's dangerous. It's too easy to rationalize, it's too easy to give reason to it. You know, everything's built into this. You know, this is where the security principle comes in, my view, why servility continues, etc. It's because of this fear of a very primary word in the Greek language, experi, right, in which means into danger. Okay?
Do you think it's a fear or an anxiety, or I guess those things are?
Well, he goes through
right?
a little bit of the fear and anxiety in today's reading.
Right.
Right, he looks at this.
Fear
Fear always has an object. Remember this. You know,
Right.
you have an object that you can put your thing on.
Yeah.
Anxiety is objectless,
Exactly.
which is kind of interesting. You know,
Which to
but
me
he's
is
looking
more
at
the security state in some ways, or
What
at
do you
least
mean
a
it's a security
data
state?
analysis, or this kind of like.
What do you mean? I'm sorry.
Because there is no object, essentially. You know, there is no terrorism. There is only the fear of terrorism,
Or there is the creation of terrorism by
right.
those who also do the data tracking of it.
Right.
You know, in that sense.
Right.
So to me, that would be more like anxiety because it's objectless than a fear. Fear would have a real object, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but the object
Is the terrorism that's
The
been
terrorism.
that occasionally you have the
Yes.
bombings,
That
the
maybe
lone
it
gunmen,
happens,
and the
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's real. You know,
Yeah.
there is an objective kind of presence,
Yeah,
and
I
you're
see.
like, oh, it's
I
not
see.
total bullshit because somebody
Yes,
just killed
that's
20
correct.
people on the West Side Highway, and
I suppose.
but it's totally innocuous because it can't threaten the state or
Right.
you know. But
Exactly.
you know,
It's not a real threat.
yeah.
Well, it's not a threat to the state. It's a real threat to the people experiencing it. I mean, obviously terrorism in Vietnam, yeah, obviously terrorism in Korea, obviously Korea, all these moments, what's going on with Syria, refugees, et cetera, is a real terrorism in a sense. But, well, I think there's a distinction here between the state terror, right, and how state terror manipulates versus, quote unquote, individual experience of terror,
right,
et cetera.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't want us to get confused, because it's right to think that the objectlessness is anxiety. Anxiety reveals nothingness. It reveals being towards death, really, in many ways. Right. This is really what's happening. The nothingness is being revealed. You're not a thing. You're not a this anymore. Etc. Right. So it is objectless, because we don't know concretely, yeah, what death is. We don't really have a description, right? I mean, we describe the horror, right, and on the surface.
Right.
We have descriptive language. We have maybe an analytical language for it, but we don't have an experiential language, in a sense, right? So try to think of it that way. Fear is something you can still put your finger on.
So that's the political object in some way, right?
The political object is always about, to me, it's about how the fear is constructed through inauthenticity.
Yeah.
That there's a relationship to inauthenticity through fear. Yeah. But the fundamental basis, again, at the bottom, if you will, if you want to layer this, right? I don't want to do it in a hierarchical schema, but if you layer this, you begin to see, anxiety is always at the root, right? If you will. Yeah. Anxiety is fundamental.
Right.
Okay. So what passage on Kant are you talking about? We'll begin there. Yeah.
Well, it's on. I think it's on 305.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. The I is a bare consciousness that accompanies all concepts. So he's breaking down Kant, showing that he misunderstands essentially the I.
Well, the problematic here is he's taking from the critique of pure reason the paralogisms of pure reason, right, as arising from a pre-phenomenological experience on page 304. And the question remains whether what was experienced in such a way ontically may be interpreted ontologically with the aid of categories mentioned. Right. So if you remember earlier in this, this we'll call it semester, I was talking about the table of categories being overturned. You remember I did those diagrams earlier? Right. So this is what he's doing again here. He's trying to get away from the categorical thinking, right, as well as categorical intuition.
Right.
So in strict conformity with the phenomenal content given in sane I, and that's the phenomenal content of I, Kant showed that the ontic thesis about the substance of the soul inferred from these characteristics are without justification. Right? But in so doing, he rejects a wrong ontic explanation of the I. He has by no means attained an ontological interpretation of selfhood, nor has he attained some assurance of it and made positive preparations for it. Although he attempts, more strictly than his predecessors, to hold on to the phenomenal content of saying I, and this goes back to Descartes, the cogito, the I am, right? He still slips back into the same inappropriate ontology of the substantial. So substance is still a category. Again, going back to the I can tell you the date of the lectures that I think I did this. That was back at the Broadway site.
Oh.
Where I put up the existentials versus the categories. Yeah. Well, this is what he's doing here.
I see.
Okay. So we must show this more precisely in order to establish what it means ontological to take saying I, as the point of the departure for the analysis of selfhood. The Kantian analysis of the I think should be referred to as an illustration, but only to the extent that it's required for the clarification of the problematic in question. The I is a bare consciousness, this is the Kantian I, that accompanies all concepts. In the I, nothing more is represented, key word right here, than a transcendental subject of thoughts. Right? Consciousness in itself is not a representation, but a form of representation in general. So representation becomes the crucial, term here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay? And he goes on. He attempts to establish, right, as the I is res cogiton, the thinking thing, as in Descartes. If he then calls this I a logical subject, this does not mean that the I in general is a concept gained by logical means, right? Rather, the I is a subject of logical behavior, of binding together. And what is that binding? The I think means that I bind together. All binding is that I bind together, and my taking together and relating I already underlies hypochemion. Hypochemion is the underlying substrata. This is how the word looks in English.
I think in the introduction to metaphysics, he also gives this kind of binding together. I don't think he uses those words exactly, but as a definition of logos.
Right.
Okay.
Okay? The binding together. Logos is also, yes, logos
gathering,
can
I
be
guess.
as a gathering of something together. Yeah, the binding is more combinatory. Think of it that way.
Okay.
Than the gathering, right? Okay, the I think is not something, so thus the subject itself is consciousness in itself, right? Not a representation, but rather the form of representation. This means that the I think is not something that's represented, but the formal structure of representing as such, and this formal structure alone makes it possible for anything to be represented. The form of representing does not means neither a framework nor a universal content, but that which is eidos makes everything represented and every representing by what it be what it is. If the I is understood as the form of representation, this amounts to saying it is the logical subject. So we're looking at the ego here. We're looking at the I in terms of, is there an ego at work, right? In this schema, right? Ultimately, because Heidegger does not want to go back to what Husserl will begin to talk about, these egological realms, right? He's trying to go beyond, the res cogiton in the Cartesian sense, and he's also trying to show simultaneously how Kant is trying to go beyond it, but still remains trapped within the general form of representation. Try to think about that. How do you produce, when you think, right? If you think, right? If we think, well, I don't know if we're really thinking yet, but anyway, again, I don't think Heidegger.
We only think in representation.
But we're thinking always in terms of what we represent to ourselves.
Yeah.
We do this in many, many ways. We tell ourselves stories. We have narratives, right? We have analytical categories, which we use, right? We have all these, all these things. So he's trying to get, to the point of where this kind of thinking is under erasure, right?
Direct
and he
experience.
sees science as a project, as part of this. Marx also understands this very well. The innocent, there's a kind of radical innocence that's really trying to be that's being attempted here. This is a great phrase to think about too. What would this mean? This is something the left has completely forgotten. Sorry.
This is Marx's phrase.
Yeah, I mean, science is radical innocence, right? And, our thinking, to put ourselves back into that Heraclitean moment of thinking like a child at play, right? In this radical innocence, where we've taken down all these forms of representational thinking. This is what he's trying to do. You have to remember, look, there's always this simultaneous reading going on. You're both destroying and constructing simultaneously, right? He's very good at that, because if you read it only in a linear or in a, the way we normally read, you miss a lot, right? And so try to read him. Heidegger is always in this moment of destruction, right? Phenomenological destruction. There's a presentation, there's an explication, but at the same time, there's a new kind of construction underway. Yeah. So, all right. So, let's go on here. So the question is here again for him: can thinking be a substance? As in Descartes, because that's the thinking thing was a substantive, and he's going to
Right.
go off. So on the other hand, he also holds fast to the I think to the I as a I think. So you have substance and thinking side by side. He considers this I again as subject, thus in an ontologically, remember, he's looking at the ontic, and we're all thinking ontically here. I promise you. I know. We're still in this ontic dimension. Even in our great reading of Heidegger, we still have so much ontic overload that we're not really totally at the ontological level, right? Thus, in an ontologically inappropriate sense, for the ontological, and this is the important part, concept of the subject does not characterize the selfhood of the I qua self, but the sameness and the constancy of something always already objectively present. A transcendental ego, if you will. To define the ontologically, the I ontological, as a subject means to posit it as something always already objectively present. The being of the I is understood as the reality of the res cogito. Okay? You see it here?
I think I get it.
Okay, no, it's no problem if you don't.
No.
This takes time.
I think it's a very interesting section.
Yeah, it is. No. What is the reason that while the I think gives Kant a genuine phenomenological point of departure, he cannot exploit it ontologically, even though he has a good point of departure, right, with this I, right, as a transcendental subject, right? Genuinely cannot exploit it, but is forced to fall back upon the subject. That is it something substantial? The I is not only an I think, but an I think something. Right? I'm thinking something. However, does not Kant again emphasize again and again that the I remains related to its representations and would be nothing without them. So the I is always in this accompaniment, right, with its representations. Again, it is a transcendental subject with representational thinking going on. It's no accident Kant's writing during the time of Isaac Newton, or underneath that, kind of moments in physics in that period. All right? But for Kant, these representations are the empirical. So now we're going to see a distinction. And look, we're not doing Kant, and of course this is a problem just beginning with Heidegger. But Kant talks about the empirical and the transcendental. This is a distinction in him. Bob, you took a course with Russell, right, on Kant? You're going through this, the transcendental.
I didn't do the Kant part.
You did the Hegel.
I just did Hegel.
Just Hegel, okay. So you have a transcendental ego, right? And an empirical, right? And this is the same. So today, people say, oh, you're only being empirical. This is part of the English school of sense experience, is what gives us our sensory data, is our reality that we need to interpret and work with. Right? And this is empiricism at work. It privileges sensory data, sensual experience, all these kind of factors, right? The transcendental is beyond that. That's this I, it goes this way. And he's going to say, Heidegger's going to say, this is the subject, the I subject, the transcendental subject in Kant, right? So
great.
He's going through these levels in Kant, okay? So let's go on, okay? So, the empirical, the appearance to which is connected. But does he never show the kind of being? What is the ontology of this connection and the accompanying? You see what he's doing? He's trying to get underneath this ontological moment of how we make these, as you said earlier, the binding, the accompaniment, the connections. How does this happen? What is happening, right? At bottom, however, their kind of being is understood as the constant objective presence of the I with its representations. Again, he's going after this objectivity, of which scientific objectivity becomes part of. Right? He's going against this, right? To show that ontologically we don't have a ground yet. He did not avoid cutting off the I from thinking, but without positing this I think in its full essential content, is I think something he never saw, right? I'm rewording here. the ontological presupposition for I think something as the fundamental determination of the self, right? What is the ontological presupposition for the I think something? For even the point of the departure of I think something is not definite enough ontologically because the something itself remains indefinite. What is it that I'm thinking, right, out there, right? If by this something we understand an inner worldly being, it tacitly implies the world has been presupposed, that this very phenomenon of the world also determines the constitution of the being of the I, if indeed it is to be possible for the I to be something like I think something. Saying I means the being that I always am as I am in a world. Kant did not see the phenomena of world and was consistent enough to keep the representations at a distance from the a priori content of the I think. But thus the I again was forced back to an isolated subject that accompanies representations in a way that is ontologically indefinite. Okay? He does not have a category such as being in the world. In saying I, design expresses itself as being in the world, but what does everyday saying I take itself as being in the world? How must we make a distinction? We must make a distinction. Surely in saying I, Dasein means the being that it is itself always is, but the everyday interpretation of the self has the tendency to understand itself in terms of the world taken care of it, or taken care of, excuse me. When Dasein has in view ontologically, it fails to see itself in relation to the kind of the being that itself is, right? And particularly true of the fundamental constitution of Dasein being in the world. Okay? So he's leading up towards care here, right? In terms of thinking and care, right? Okay? So, I mean, do you have another question? I mean, he's moving towards now the foundation. You know, that without a foundational moment of care, Zorga, this call of conscience, this carefulness, mindfulness, heedfulness, he uses all this. We do not really talk about, you know, the I think or anything about representation. That Kant does not have that category for being in the world.
I mean, to me, it was more that the world that we think of or that we participate in is this world of representation. Yeah, and that Heidegger is trying to move to this other, in kind of thinking of the world as, or of the self actually, as a project, as
well, I mean,
care,
remember the triad I developed earlier on? I mean, try to always think it in terms of self, right? Worlds, right? And care, right? This is where we're really going, you know, in a way.
Yeah.
Right? We're trying to, you know, think this through in terms of a philosophy of subjectivity, but the subjectivity here is not the traditional notion of the subject. Right. It's the question of our orientation, our there-ness, our place, right? Our topos, our there-ness, the care that's associated with that, and how does one, you know, in that, you know, determine authenticity and inauthenticity in one's life, right?
Yeah.
How does one,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just very clear in this section, in particular. You know,
okay.
This is where it happens, I think.
Oh, you mean what he's setting up?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, this is the setup.
I mean, we've talked about a lot of it already, but like
okay.
in particular, this chapter,
I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah. So you're basically saying in this section before today's reading, right?
Yeah.
In some ways, which is basically the section on, you know, what he's setting up here is the hermeneutical situation. You know, he sets up interpreting the meaning of the being of care and the character of the existential analytic in general.
Yeah.
So this is a summation, if you will, from page 297 to the end of this, right? So you could look at this, yes, I mean, that's a very good point, that you could look at this section as a summation of what he's done in the existential analytic before he goes on to temporality and everydayness, right?
Yeah.
And, yeah. Okay, yeah, good. All right, well, yeah.
I mean, it was also just the part about Kant. I mean, not to go back too much, but he gave some like specific categories of. Let me find where it is. that I just thought were interesting too. But
Yeah, sure, no problem.
we can move.
I mean, it's good to read Kant alongside of this,
Yeah,
too. I mean,
yeah.
I'm not saying Kant's a more turgid writer than Heidegger.
Boring.
In some ways, yeah. And then Hegel's
He was isolated up there in the Baltics.
No,
you know?
it's hard, man.
Very
He
isolated.
was in Königsberg, the Chinaman of Königsberg, right? And then the man in the hut. These are your philosophers. And then the man of, Jena, right before he got to Berlin, Hegel. Here comes the world spirit on horseback. Right? Anyway. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, look, again, the long footnote on page 306, presence means constant accompaniment, And this is something that the Derridians, especially Derrida himself, always talks about. The question really is it's not only the question of the forgetting of being, or what is being, but it's what's prior to that, the question of the question, right, in some ways. And is that question ultimately, the pre-predicative eros, or what do we really see before being? What do we hear before all of this? This is where they're backing, if you will. This is the kind of, what you would call in phenomenological terms an infinite regression. The regressive analysis. You're regressing. Not in the negative sense. Regressive means you're getting to some phenomena, right? Yeah. So, anyway, but I mean, I like the river, the water, these are good. No, it's good. I mean, the springing is also, you can think of this like the body, too. What is the temporal ecstasies, right, in the self? The future always springs forth. In that springing forth is where the fear, the anxiety takes hold. This is where the project is. You project into the future, You don't, This is all part of the thrownness. See, the thrownness is a very important part because that's where the pre-predicative is. How is the dice cast in each and every one of our existence, right?
So we're thrown into the world.
We're thrown into the world, right? Yeah, we're thrown into the world. And we forget this. We forget the contingency, that nature of which we're thrown, right? And then we become habituated to certain kind of very rational structures or everyday life that overcomes us, and we forget the contingent nature both of our existence and, what our projects are and should be. So this is very important to keep in mind. Yeah.
So that's basically changing the political project requires dehabituation of the internalized rational
Absolutely.
frameworks.
Yeah.
So how do you do it? So this is one way of doing it.
One way of doing it is where you
It's-
take the representational thinking and you're always undoing that kind of thinking by propositions. I'm thinking about, look, I've got some, interests in, people with arthritis, so to speak, right? So I'm looking into rheumatoid arthritis, which is vicious, right? And it looks like. And I'm asking myself, how does science approach this thing? So I'm reading all this medical stuff. And when I begin to look at the medical stuff, I say they work by propositional logic. They always have propositions about stuff, but they never really look at the phenomena all the way, right? In a sense. What is rheuma? The inflammation, right? What is the arthritis, the pain that comes to the joints? What, not causality or treatment, right, which is always the model, but what is this a result of in the total system, in the whole body? How does this occur? Of course, they're going to give you genetic reasons, it's inherited, it's autoimmune, these are the reasons that are given. I'm not saying that they're completely wrong and they have drugs that reduce the pain, right?
It's food.
Yeah, what?
It's food.
What?
Food.
Food.
Yeah.
What kind of food?
Causes inflammation.
Yes,
So
that's
you're
true.
gonna-
Well, then, no, it's recommended you don't have dairy.
Acidic food
You don't
especially.
have dairy.
If it's very
you don't have
acidic.
dairy.
I know a lot
or
about that now.
not too much
After my
wine.
diagnosis.
Yeah, right. But I mean, you've been through this.
Yeah.
Look how the scientific project thinks. You have to ask this question. It doesn't think according to Heidegger. I mean, this is the kind
They
of
said
stuff
that-
that's very radical here. In the again, if you think about this, how does science operate? Through hypothetical thinking and propositions, right? Always. What is its logic? How does it proceed?
It's trial and error, in a sense.
Yes, in some ways it is trial and error, but at the same time they always come up with working propositions. It's proposition logic. It's not positional logic. It's not Setzung. It's not the position or the subject position, which actually comes out of this too, which is a very radical concept, in terms of being there, that you have the subject position. Yeah, this is a question of, again, agency, learning, opening up that space for learning. So, yeah, but I mean, think about this. How do you approach any of these, issues that people are just totally medicated for? I understand that this arthritis is treated by massive drugs, but the side effects are awful. It alleviates the pain, people can function, but at the same time, the side effects are massive. And you may be killing, it's just like my father with the leukemia. We're going to kill, the cells, right?
Before it kills
Before
you.
it kills you. That's the thing. So we're destroying your immune system, right? Even more. Right? This is what they do. This is cancer treatment's really based on this premise, right? I mean, I may be off, but from the best I know, the idea is the war machine. You kill, you go in there.
Chemotherapy.
Chemotherapy is one very good example of this. Right.
You drink poison.
Yeah. I mean, they broke down my father, leukemia. He had leukemia. There's no family history of this. Goes to the biggest cancer center in the southeast, MD Anderson Clinic.
Texas, right?
Yeah, in Texas, Houston, Texas. Yeah.
Was it effective for a while? Or?
No, I mean, they break him down. He's like 60 pounds lighter, etc. He ended up dying because of the hospital disease, the bacteria in the hospital. Yeah, 1990. I told him go home and to die with dignity. That was my last words to him. Yeah. I said, they're going to kill you in the hospital. I already told him. I mean, I said that to him. What can I do, Michael? He tells me. Yeah. Anyway, but I mean, I studied this in the sense of, why aren't we always talking about, I mean, the fundamental political project for the body and the resistance to me is immunology. How do you strengthen the immune system in this incredibly toxic environment, in this ethos? What is this about? This is the notion of biopolitics.
Yeah.
This is the shift that took place, and so postmodernism, with the Esposito, the people that started to talk about, contagion and contact, Melissa Cooper, life as surplus. This was a new movement, right, outside of this. So the immunology is based against representational thinking, against categorical thinking, right? Against substantialization of the ego, right? What ego, right? This is Lacan at work too, yeah. And Freud. The ego is not a master in itself. Freud's doing basically the same thing in another way, saying that this ecological realm and consciousness is minimal. Yeah, he's the one. Says that, the ego's not even a master in itself. Yeah, and not one person that's analyzed Trump has used any of that kind of stuff, to put it out. What you basically have is there's no ego in the house, and that's one of the reasons there's total pandemonium, right? right? Even though they all think they have egos, right? This is the amazing thing, how determinate the structure is at this point that allows for this stuff to happen day in, day out. I don't know. Does it make sense? I mean, to agree. Yeah.
Yeah. I just like the idea of kind of putting the self somewhere else. That it isn't a conception of I as ego, but it's in the project. It's in what you do in the world, basically.
I mean, the self is.
Idea.
You are the work.
Yeah.
You are the. In Cecil Taylor's category. The piano is 88 tuned drums. 88 keys of tuned drums. That's what he called the piano.
Yeah.
Right? And then he became all 88 tuned drums. Yeah. So it's interesting in that way. Look, again, this is a long story, and we can continue on this theme. It's a very important theme, representational thinking. This is what Heidegger's after.
Yeah.
This is what that's why he says we have not yet begun to think. because we're still thinking in representation. So, yeah. Yeah. Marx does not use my method of presentation. He starts, is different from my method of research. We were talking about this earlier, the Vorstellung and the Darstellung, in Capital especially. Yeah. Yeah. I don't begin with people. I begin the world as an immense accumulation of commodities. This is Marx's version of the world, right? Is an immense accumulation of commodities. And I will break that commodity form, this is his construction, into two values, right? The commodity, the use value and the exchange value. And he builds his entire system on this initial analysis of the commodity form, the form of a commodity, which for him is the world that he's investigating. Heidegger's world is different, right? Heidegger's world is always worldly, right? Heidegger's not interested. He already knows. Look, they both have one thing in common. They despise capitalism, right? But Heidegger's not interested in going through the analysis of the system that way. He's a philosopher.
Yeah.
Marx is not, quote, a pure philosopher in this respect. He's not still engaging these questions of, yeah. Okay, so it kind of, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
kind of.
kind of. Oh,
No, I
yeah.
mean, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
we've been doing this for like a year.
Okay, repetition, huh? Repetition's working. Huh? Yeah.
Difference in repetition.
Yeah, difference in repetition. Well, the question is, will the repetition yield the difference, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, ultimately. But you picked a very good section, because this
Yeah.
is basically the section in which, let me look back at my note. I think I did this very early. We were looking at categorical thinking versus remember world for Heidegger. Yeah,
I
please.
think you touched on it.
Yeah,
actually.
I did, yeah.
You didn't really go through it. You just
Okay,
touched on it.
I just touched on it, okay. I'm just trying to look, going back here. These are all the stuff from 2018. Let me just see something here. I think I was a little earlier. I think it was the time when we were looking at, for if you remember, transcendental for Heidegger was the double step backwards, right? You had the double step that you make. Foundational ontology made the sciences possible, whereas fundamental ontology made the foundational, science possible, right? And the first is always metaphysical, whereas the second is phenomenological. That's one thing we did. And, transcendental usually means, stepping back into the conditions of possibility, right? So you're always taking a step back. What are the conditions for the possibility of this representational thinking? And also stepping beyond this springing forth into the world. So you have this dual movement always going on. Stepping back, what are the conditions for the possibilities of the production of knowledge, And secondly, the stepping beyond, right? So you want to really trace the movement. But I had a good chart on it. I remember I did a chart for you guys. I think it was at the 72nd Street. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, here we go. I'll do this again, since you brought it up today. And this is going all the way back to the, the opening, the introduction. you know, where he talks about, you know, the a priori, the historical, and the existential. Yeah, let me just make sure I got both of them here. Around here. Just give me a second. I thought I had a very good thing on categories and existentials. There's a diagram. Sometimes it's good to just go back to the diagram.
This one?
Yeah, that's it. Beautiful.
Do you
Yeah.
want to borrow?
Yeah, if you want. Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Next.
At the beginning, existential project.
Yes, yeah, the object of the inquiry, right? So you have object of inquiry, and you have to keep this in mind too, right? Of inquiry. And, yeah, the type, right, as one. Then the terms. What are the terms, you know, and then of course the status of the occurrence. And fourth, the types of awareness, types of self-awareness. And he's going to get into this as, you know, you have an ontological, right, and an ontic. So the ontic still remains in the ontic most of the time because of the representational thinking. The ontological is a very different type of inquiry. So this is always going on, Josh. I mean, you know, to read Heidegger carefully, you always have to think, especially in Sein und Zeit, that you're always doing both an ontological inquiry and an ontic inquiry. Social, everydayness, averageness, all these things, then the foundation of that. Yeah, what were we going to say?
Yeah, just
Yeah,
the
sure.
difference between ontic and ontological.
Ontological is the fundamental,
Right.
right? And the ontic could sometimes act as foundational, or as bricks and mortar of the foundational, but it's not really fundamental.
Okay.
It's not at the bottom. The ontological is always the inquiry into being as being.
Okay.
Okay? It's always this forgetting of the question. That's what we're trying to do, is get back to the question of being. What does it mean to be? You know, both things and, you know, self. But we're not going to say us. We're going to say Dasein. Right? Dasein is an ontic determination. Sein is an ontological determination. Okay? So the ontic here, you know, your inquiry through the transparency, again, of the Dasein and our everydayness, our there-ness, our everydayness. But then, this somehow is brought back to more fundamental questions. What were the conditions for the possibility of that there-ness? What were the conditions for the possibility of that in interpretation, right, et cetera, right? So the ontological. So then you have the terms, right? So you begin with existentials, right, in the ontological, the being, in terms of being, right? Sein, uppercase Sein. You begin with the existentials versus that of the categories. So he's trying to get outside of categorical thinking, right? Okay? Try to think this through. So again, well, as I said, existence literally means to be outstanding. You're outstanding. You're outside of the standing where you are. That's what the word existence really means. No, yeah, to be out of oneself in a certain way. Depression, kind of makes you draw inward, right? You're not really existing in that sense because you're not standing out. You're not springing forth, right? So then you have the statuses of the curves. One is factical, so facticity. What Artaud's doing with his Lenin piece, he's going through many facticals. He's not doing just factual, right? And this is another interesting thing of one's existential outstandingness and one's facticity. It's a much better place to begin in terms of a totality of one's being in the world. Okay? Versus that of categories and factuals. Okay? You understand? I mean, in a sense. And this is much richer, at least in my mind, in what's going on. And then you have the types of awareness. So you live either in the existential. Thank you very much, Rachel. I couldn't even find it. And the existential. And going back here to what you read to me earlier by Schurman.
Yeah, from the
Right. The existentials, right? Excuse me, ELL. Are really part of that pre-predicative ontic, right? So you have the types of inquiry, the ontic, the ontological. Yeah, this is good. So so does this help somewhat? So the categorical, you're always accompanying your representations here. You're still in representational thinking. You're still dealing with factuals, right? In a sense.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I think I grasped it.
Okay.
firstly.
No, it's okay. I'm
No,
repeating
yeah.
it about,
Yeah.
for all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. This is how you do the inquiry. This is the mode. For Marx, you're going to begin with, look, if you start looking at this, the object of inquiry. What's Marx's object of inquiry? Capital. A critique.
of the political economy's take on capital.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? The Das Kapital, Volume 1, right? Where do we begin? We begin with form. We begin with a representation. We're
Not
going
what
to
the
break
commodity's
down.
called, which is a product or
Yes,
whatever.
yes, that's
in
right.
the language of
Right,
representation.
that's right.
It's
In
my
the language
product,
of, yes.
my property.
Yeah. My property and my property, right? But the world itself, right, is a vast, immense accumulation of commodities. And who lives in this kind of ontic, inauthentic space? It's the reified, consciousness. The reified consciousness. The what if, the if only, the as if consciousness, right, is always living in this level, right? So what is the task of capital at one level? And what Marx instructed his French readers especially to do, read it slowly. Because it's meant in serial form to educate, right, the worker, right, on how, right?
Yeah.
Right? No, so think about it. Now think about the intention here.
Yeah.
To educate the worker about how the consciousness got reified, how the worker itself became not only a reified consciousness, but a commodity, right? In a world of the things ready to hand. Heidegger's close to Marx in this sense, right? The things ready to hand and the things present to hand. And what happens to the worker is he becomes totally objectified in the world of the things present to hand, right? The objectified world. Yeah. So you begin to study, unlike Dasein, right? You begin to study labor, right? And laboring activity.
Yeah, but
I'm listening.
Heidegger's project is pretty similar, actually,
Yes,
because
of course.
Marx says philosophy is to change the world, and Heidegger says the self is the project, essentially.
Yeah.
So these are, in some
Yes.
ways, the same project.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you say the same, but I think they're on certain critical levels that are very similar in many ways.
And also this
right?
is-
and this
yeah.
and you have to remember again, the interesting thing about Heidegger, Nazi, non-Nazi, whatever, springtime for Hitler or winter for Goebbels, whatever you like, right, in this context, is that it is futural. You're talking about futural Marx here, in a lot of ways. You really are, in a sense, right? It's futural.
Yeah.
This is the thinker of time,
Yeah.
not the thinker or the critical thinker of capital, but the thinker of time. Yeah, this is really the
Which
the-
maybe in the 21st century is the equivalent of the commodity of Marx's time. Sort of the commodification of time.
The object here
Time
is
is money, right?
is time
Because
as money. Capitalism
Well-
has made us so stupid. It makes us think. Listen to the Kantian categories. It makes us think in terms of the O and the ought. Everybody thinks in terms of the O and the ought. Think about this in your own daily life. What do I owe and what ought I to do? Right? Think of the debt economy. What's been going
Which is
on,
time premise.
which is
The
going
payment
in
is
time
coming up,
premise.
the next
the
month's
O and
payment.
the ought that is on a durational time thing. Think of the trading mechanisms of the algorithms. What's going on. Yeah, this is very interesting once you begin to
And also
kind of
there's
try
this,
to cross the two in a they're like trains passing in the night, but at the same time
Parallel, yeah.
they're parallel.
Yeah, true.
And the track is leaving that station of advanced industrial capitalism in both cases. And one, in terms of the transition from what Marx could not see was the transition to technological capitalism, and certainly the intricacies of finance capital.
the comrades in Bulgaria, where they work on this problem using Schumpeter as well, and they argue that
Right.
Marx
Tell them
unders-
who Schumpeter is.
Schumpeter was this Austrian economist who spent a lot of time
Joseph.
sort of trying to explain capitalist crisis through the
History of
innovation.
Business Cycles.
Right,
is
so
the book.
innovation is very important in capitalism.
Yeah.
So the comrades in Bulgaria, they're basically like Marx understood this, but he didn't really have the time to
Right.
write it or whatever.
Right.
That surplus value, the foundational block of capitalist, the reproduction of capital, is actually produced by a very few number of workers per corporation, let's say. And those are the innovative workers. Those are the workers that
Right.
sort of have it in them for whatever reason to be really productive by innovating, like a new way of putting the car together or whatever. The rest of the workers are like dead. They're like dead,
Tell me about
what do you
it.
call it? Dead weight, right? Now, but capitalism has to deal with the
Miss
dead weight.
99 speaks.
So the boss has
Going
to
to
deal with
Miss
the dead weight.
145.
So the comrades in Bulgaria say that actually the whole goal of capital today is to actually account for time, because they're paying actually the workers for just to count time. So time actually is more important to them and sort of than the actual commodities
Well,
that
the
the workers
counting
create,
of time
except
again
the innovative
is
workers.
not time to Heidegger. It's a function of time.
Right.
It's time as measurement, and it's time as
Right.
part of now
It's
sequential
Newtonian time
and linear
that
Newtonian time.
that the
Yeah.
shitty
Yeah.
work,
Yes,
the
of
shitty
course,
workers
of
are
course.
subject to. But the innovative
Yeah,
worker
yeah,
is when
yeah,
the different
yeah.
temporal scale kicks in.
Right.
That's where the accelerations come in, the brakes,
Right.
the ruptures.
Sure.
And that solves crises in capitalism. So it's not the proletariat that's the revolutionary engine. Actually, it's just in a way, it's like Lenin's insight too, but from a different angle. It's the innovative workers who become the vanguard if they become politicized the correct way.
Yes.
Otherwise, they just work hard to reproduce capital because they
Right.
get better pay,
Right.
better.
Of
you know.
course. Of course.
That's nice.
So I don't know. This is interesting. Heidegger. It's almost like he kind of sensed the similar. I don't know. They're in different orbits, but
yeah, they're in
different tracks.
very
but-
different orbits and
but-
very different backgrounds in terms of what they're reading.
But the enemy is
and
the same.
thinking about. But yes, the enemy is really who controls time. Yeah, what is the control of time here? And first of all, in Heidegger's case, the question of what is the being of time? I mean, what does this really mean to us? And we still haven't hit the levels, right? I mean, we're talking about fourth and fifth dimension here, at least, right? No longer the two-dimensional, three-dimensional space of capital, right?
Or
Yeah.
the zero dimensional. I mean,
Yeah,
we
well,
want to
zero.
get rid of the
We're at
dimensions.
zero dimensions in many things with the new phones. This
Yeah.
is what Apple has figured out: how you go back to zero dimension.
What do you mean
In a
by
certain-
like
Well,
zero?
I mean zero dimension. You have no dimensional space anymore. You're always in the screen. You know, you become part of the screen.
You're virtual.
Yeah,
You
of
know,
course.
you've virtualized yourself, but you're
Yes,
still
it's virtual.
alive.
Yes, of
so you're
course.
kind of
Well,
dead.
You know, homo
You're like a
datum.
living.
She-
Yeah.
My friend laughed when I said, you know, homo datum. I was having a friend working on homo datum. She was laughing.
That might take
But
20 years, though.
That's
I don't know.
okay.
I'm not
It's
making
okay.
good progress.
She'll probably
not
have at
making good
least
progress.
10 compositions, you know, on homo datum by then. Right. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. But yeah, I mean, look, again, I'm not trying to synthesize Marx and Heidegger. I'm trying to say, look, there are many similarities here in terms of the objects of critique, right? And I think by the reading of Heidegger, you begin to see the temporality, you know, that's involved in all of this.
Yeah.
Marx never really gives, you know, he understands the time of labor. He understands, obviously, the time of the creation of the surplus. He has very long things about this, you
Yeah.
know? I mean, this is
It's a
you know,
huge insight into
Yeah.
Marx, actually.
yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the body. What is the body doing in the repetitive labor, right? What is happening in the measurements, you know, et cetera? What is happening to the physical body, the movement, all of this. And this is a great insight by a phenomenologist, and the book never took hold in the United States. It should have, called Marx is, what's the name? It's Michel Henry is the author. What was it? The Philosophy of Marx, it's called. Michel Henry is his name. Henry. Yeah.
We've changed the way we pass our shirts and blazers and tops because we're all crouched forward.
Really?
We've like
Yes.
That's
we've
disgusting.
added like humps on
Good
the dress
point.
form.
What?
Oh my God.
And so normally for a woman you have to like make shape over the bust, right? That's like a 3-dimensional volume.
fucking
No,
kidding me?
and this used to be straight.
Yes.
But if we do that, then
anymore.
it doesn't fit
my
anymore.
God.
It doesn't fit us
That's
anymore.
crazy.
So we've like started to curve over the hunchback. You got it too, man.
I have a hunchback?
I need to go
Oh, I
this
have a
way.
hunchback?
Be careful.
Oh,
Be
I'm gonna be
careful of
careful. I
that
gotta-
zero-dimensional
I need to lean
space.
back more.
I know.
My feet up.
We're gonna do stretching exercises.
I was
next
also-
to them. Stretches of time and timing.
That's
I was
right.
also told that.
So now there's
you. I
like volume
appreciate
here and here for a woman.
That's very good. I was also told that hunching over compresses your, affects your lower esophageal
does.
sphincter, and
Yeah.
it causes
Of course.
reflux and
Yeah,
all
it
these
does.
other
It
does.
explosions.
That's
of
your
reflux
problem?
and- yeah, probably.
There you go. We figured
Too
it
much
out
computer
today.
time.
Yeah.
Back to the field.
You see, now you just have to lean back and, like on Span playing the piano. Look at his posture. You know, go look at piano players. Their posture. I'm serious. Look at Billy Taylor.
They sit on a
Look
stool.
at- look
That's
at-
But Cecil looks very tortured. What do you- He's in a different dimension.
He's in the piano.
Yeah.
He is the piano.
He's playing the drums.
Yes.
Yeah.
88 tune drums.
With the Muslim cap and
He's
everything.
the man.
Yeah.
Lives around the corner. 135 Fort Greene Place.
Really?
You hear
Yes.
crazy sounds occasionally?
I used to hear a few. I see him bebopping around. Yeah. Some guy waited out his house to do a film on him for a week. Finally let him in. Okay, you can come in now. You've been
That's
here.
funny.
I've been watching you all week, hanging around my door. Yeah, he's great. But I mean, this is good because please, Phil. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
like, with Marx, like, and, you know, in terms of time, like, Bellamy Foster is always talking these days of, like, Marx had this concept of the metabolic rift.
That's in the ecological. He's
Oh,
trying
yeah,
to make
I've heard
Marx an
that.
Right.
ecological thinker.
Right.
To my mind, Marx,
doesn't like
just by saying labor dominates, right, the
Right.
object, Marx is not an ecologist.
Right.
Marx is
Well,
very
he's social.
Yes, he's social. Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's not a letting nature be as
I
it
don't know if
is.
everybody
It's
else
it's
is,
a
but
acting on nature. in Heidegger is a very different approach to nature.
'Cause in a way,
And this is
nature
why
acts
Heidegger
upon
has
us
been
too,
taken
you know.
up by Arnie Nass
Yeah.
and
Winds
other
and
people of
snow
the, in
and
the
shit.
ecological movement.
Freeze to
Terrible.
death,
Yeah,
you know.
I mean, I understand.
Terrible
the
says
cost
to,
of things
to
and
Jamaica,
all that.
you know.
Yeah, because, and Jason Moore thinks he's full of shit, but.
It's not good for you.
Jason Moore's
It's not, it's
not
probably
the
bad for you.
worst
Well,
one.
yeah.
I think so. I
Yeah.
mean, anyway.
Depression, drinking,
Yeah, yeah.
right? But snow.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, no, in a way, I mean, Marx is, I mean, at least the way I read him, I mean, look,
Yeah.
capital to me at one level should be read as black humor. We still laugh, right? We laugh, about who's getting screwed, what's happening, this becomes part of everyday life in a certain way. We get angry about it, of course, we're indignant, but at the same time, we see what's going down all the time, right? And so it's black humor of what this thing called capitalism is at one level. On another level, he's obviously very impressed with the robustness and the machinery of the system. Because he always says that the capitalists have built weapons that can be wielded against them. So he's not against, massive industrialization and massive, extraction of surplus value. I mean, he'll talk about that and give you the mathematics of it. But in a sense, he's also saying this is a necessary moment in the history in order to take, control and use the weapons against it. So and labor is always acting on material, including nature.
Right.
Including nature. And part of the argument, what's the book called? Fossil Capitalism? Andreas, the German? Mom. Yeah, it's a good book.
Yeah, it
because he
is.
looks at the steam
Yeah.
engine and he looks at these things in a very different way.
Yeah.
And where Marx may have missed much of the innovations and the moments of his time and how contributory they were beyond that of just the labor. You have to look at the machines that are being.
There's another interesting here.
Yeah, like water power actually did just as well
Yes,
as
right.
steam power.
Right.
Yeah.
But steam power was more, you could put it into a confined space
Right.
and control the
Right.
the workers.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Look, who controls the clock controls the.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is what capitalism does. This is why, I call this time after time. It's about Wiederholung. It's about repetition, like we're doing today. We're back, 10 weeks ago,
Yeah.
and Rachel's good notes here, and all of this, that I couldn't find in my own. But anyway, also there are many mistakes made in this repetition too. It's very important in time after time. One of the reasons for the title here, and certainly in Marx as well. In Marx as well. So, I think what we've forgotten, in a lot of ways, is how much in a world we are, because we're so accustomed to being habituated to run, move A to B. B to C, all of these kind of movements, etc. We forget what it means to be in a world, right? We've forgotten this inness, if you will, and also the orientation. We've forgotten this completely. We don't really think bodily, spatially, and place-wise. We're always thinking, especially in New York City, we're by the grid always. We're always kind of grid-oriented. We very few of us think about the encompassing. Few of us think about, the circle, the daily circle, if you will, of existence. All of these things have been pretty much forgotten. And in a way, this becomes a very interesting book as also a therapeutic. That bases itself, to go back to one of the original working premises, that what's being set up here is a kind of new philosophy of care, and I'll add contribution to this, but really that without care, and this is a lack, in my opinion, with Deleuze and Guattari, why they don't really have a category of care. They don't really have an existential care in their work. They have everything else, the analytic down, they understand what's going on, but they don't really have the care. This is something that I'm seeing. Yeah, what were we going to say?
Oh, no, you were talking about therapeutic, and in the section that we read for this week, there's this really beautiful Aristotle definition of fear
Yes.
as depression.
Yeah, I was going to
confusion.
talk about that.
Beautiful.
Yeah. It's beautiful. Yeah, I went back to the rhetoric and read it this morning.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah. So maybe we can go back to the text, huh?
Yeah.
I mean, do we clarify the Kant to a degree? I mean,
Yeah,
I'm just trying
definitely,
to.
yeah.
I'm just trying. I can go on about this. But I
Yeah.
think just for purposes of time.
No, it was more like I
Yeah,
understood the
yeah.
general concept, of course. It was
Right.
more like in this chapter, it seemed more explicit, so I just wanted to go through it a
This
little
is
bit.
a very key preposition, prefix, right? The pre. The pre is very important. The pre-predicative, the preposition, right? All of these things are very, very important in him. Also, pre also means near in French, right? The pre, right? The nearness of something, right? And always thinking Heidegger, not in the traditional thesis antithetical sense, but in terms of absence, presence, nearness, farness, these kind of movements. You're always thinking this way in Heidegger, right? This is the tension that's created constantly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, life and death, natality, mortality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is how he operates. Yeah. And the deconstruction of the dualisms, right? In order to get back to this level that we talked about earlier, the experiential, right? The danger. Yeah. Danger is not a bad word for these people. It's not a bad word, No. I mean, it's not a negative connotation. It means risk, And that's another thing that society is so risk averse. That's another thing that rationalization has done. We cannot ever take a risk. Okay? Anyway. So, all right. So yeah, let's go over the section. That's good. Let me just make sure I got the notes correct here. Too much paper. What do you need?
Rachel's chart.
Oh, I took your chart?
No. I was just commenting on how nice it was.
Oh, yeah, it was nice. Yeah, I could read it right away. Yeah, no problem. And she could give me essays and handwritten. Okay, so I put this today because I think it's very, very important. I said we should begin on page 319. Right? And the issue here is really everydayness and temporality, because then again he goes into unconcealment, disclosedness, aletheia, as well as understanding, attunement again, and then the temporality of attunement. And if you go to page, let's start with what Josh said, and we'll let Josh, kind of set the frameworks today.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. No, it's no problem. It is very beautiful. And I actually went back and read Aristotle this
I want to
morning.
go to it.
In this, So let's take a look at the temporality of attunement for a second, and then we'll go back to other sections. Let me just start here first. Let's go through the three A's, right? Anticipation, attunement, and authenticity. Okay, so let's try to think that, as a combinatory. So begin on page 322. We shall retain the expression anticipation, vorlaufen, for the terminological characterization of the authentic future. Okay, the authentic future. This is crucial. It indicates that Dasein, authentically existing, lets itself come toward itself as its own most potentiality of being. That the future, and this is great, must first win itself, not from a present, but from the inauthentic future. This is crucial. We're not going to get anywhere with protest resistance, political correctness,
And
all this
victimhood.
stuff, and victimhood,
And trauma.
and the politics of victimhood and trauma. It's not going to happen. I mean, trauma to a degree is interesting because it gives meaning. You can give trauma meaning, but the rest of this stuff, forget it. Forget it, in a certain way. Okay? The formally neutral term for the future lies in the designation of the first structural factor of care, that being ahead of itself. Factically, Dasein is constantly ahead of itself, but in its existential possibility, what we diagrammed, still on the board, right? Possibility, existential possibility, inconstantly anticipatory. How is the inauthentic future to be contrasted with this? Since the authentic future is revealed in resoluteness, the inauthentic future, as an ecstatic mode, can reveal itself only by going back ontologically from the everyday, inauthentic understanding, taking care of things, to the existential and temporal meaning. As care, again, where we are. Dasein is essentially ahead of itself. And remember that. I mean, this is Stiegler's category of, goes beyond primary narcissism, of auto-affection. You must have auto-affection going forward. Yeah.
I see.
All right? Think about it.
Self-affection.
Self-affection.
Affection for the self.
Self-affection for the self. For who you are. Yeah, that's a starting point always. Right? So, as care, essentially ahead of itself, initially and for the most part, the being in the world that takes care understands itself in what it takes care of. Inauthentic understanding projects itself upon what can be taken care of, what can be done, what is urgent or indispensable in the business of everyday activity. The worker is described right here. Yeah. But what is taken care of is as it is for the sake of the potentiality of being that cares. This potentiality lets Dasein come toward itself in its heedful being together with what is to be taken care of. Dasein does not come toward itself primarily in its own most non-relational potentiality for being, but it awaits this heedfully in terms of that which what is taken care of produces or denies. Dasein comes towards itself in terms of what is taken care of, the unauthentic future as the character of awaiting, and in some ways the delay that Freud talks about, always the deferred action, The self-understanding of the they that takes care in terms of what one is doing has the ground of its possibility and the ecstatic mode of the future. Right? And only because factical Dasein is thus awaiting its potentially for being in terms of what is already taken care of it, can it expect and wait for. Awaiting must always already have disclosed the horizon and the scope of which something can be expected. Expecting is a mode of the future found in awaiting that temporalizes itself authentically as anticipation. Thus, a more primordial being towards death lies in anticipation than in the heedful expecting of it. So we're always in this anticipatory resoluteness. We have to be resolute towards the future. Yeah? And resolute has many, obviously, resonations, right? In the sense of that you resolve something, right? Internally. You're resolving something as well, yeah? The problematic, as well as resolute in your being going forward. Right? Yeah? Existing in the potentiality of being, however it may be projected, understanding is primarily futural. This is part of the problem in the academies today. I have to say this. Again, there's no understanding, therefore no future of our educational institutions. There's no understanding. I'm very torn up about this, but the more I see, in terms of what's going on in these universities, especially at the second and third tier levels, and even at the first tier. I have relatives that go to the good schools, and I can tell, talking to the kids, they're not getting that much at this point. There's not really understanding anymore.
What is it? It's just instrumental reasoning.
Instrumental reasoning, and also a question of teaching to the test. What do I have to do?
Data.
How do I present? It's not only ordering of data. Also, how do I present something? How do I? And the lawyers. There's no understanding of really what the law is about. There's an understanding of how I use case law and precedent in order to argue something. That's means to ends. That's instrumental, as you say. It's not really understanding law. Yeah, please. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was talking about that piece on Russia TV, about this statement by this German minister of education who said, you know, once you start charging for education, it becomes a commodity. And when it becomes a commodity, it just becomes instrumental.
Yes.
And once it becomes instrumental, it's not really learning.
Right.
The Germans still have some kind of leftover.
Yeah,
of
yeah. They said, he said, here in Germany, we do have instrumentation. It's called apprenticeship.
Right.
But in the university, we should be, you know, doing something more than that.
Right. Right. No, absolutely. I mean, you know, and yeah. I mean, we see it every day. I mean, it's really a very strange phenomena.
You know,
what's
at
going on.
BMCC we have this conference that we propose on the question of technology.
Right.
And there was a rebellion in the departmental meeting, and most of the people showed no interest, and they didn't submit papers because they thought the topic was too different, like too separated from the reality of our students who are traumatized victims that need help. Like, these were the arguments.
They're traumatized victims.
Yeah.
They're
Terrorism,
traumatized
police
by the
abuse,
technology.
You know, well,
That's the whole point.
They didn't see
That would have opened up
They didn't see
everything. That's what they're totally traumatized with. They have no minds.
yeah.
There's no memory. You know, and it's not the memory. It's not the no memory that you get. I don't know if you've read Benito Cereno. I've been thinking about that by Melville. Babo, the slave who rebels, right? And he says, and the master of the ship. You know, this is taken from a document. You know, I don't know. Benito Cereno is one of Melvin's masterpieces as a novella. I recommend reading it. Babo is the slave who rebels, and he says they have no memory. You know, this is why they're able to do this. Now, of course, if you read this in terms of Jose Dolores and Byrne or whatever, and this is a kind of presupposition, Benito Cereno is great reading alongside Byrne, by the way, about the movie by Pontecorvo. You know, Jose Dolores is not about the lack of memory. It's just that this is not our memory, right, that we're dealing with. We're dealing with the decolonization, of which Sartre, again, right, I'm very much immersed in this right now, the Sartrean introduction to The Wretched of the Earth, where the African sees the Parthenon and can hardly say the words. You know, what does Western democracy really have to do with a colonialized subject? What does the Enlightenment have to do with a colonialized subject in a certain way? What kind of new vocabulary? And I refer people again, I know I'm going on and on here, but I refer you to Jean Genet's May Day speech of 1970, where he talks about the new language, right? The language of the black, right? It's very, very good here. When he was with Bobby Seale in New Haven, he was smuggled in from Montreal, by the way. During that period, right? Yeah, go ahead, please, Phil.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I know.
Yeah,
It's true.
there's a really good interview with that Tariq Ali does, and I can't remember the guy's name.
Right.
He's an academic from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania.
Oh, Samir Amin?
Oh, Sami
No,
Amin
it's
is
not
smart
Sami Amin.
guy.
Somebody
Yeah,
else.
smart
No.
guy.
But
I like Sami Amin. I'm not in total agreement, but he's got really good things to say.
Yeah, but it was really interesting because he was talking about Joseph Nyerere and how Nyerere, you know, in many ways, you know, and Tariq Ali was saying this. He said, "Yeah, I remember back when all these revolutions were happening and all this decolonization was happening, and we all looked at Nyerere as kind of like this milquetoast revolutionary, not a real Leninist or
Right.
something like that, you know."
Right.
But in a way, Nyerere had turned out to be a visionary.
Right. Yeah, another great figure too, and I'm going to try to do something for situations on this guy in the future, is Pierre Guillotin. You probably haven't heard of him.
Is he French? Or?
Yeah, he's French, Algerian French, right? Guillotin. La Prostitution, right? And Eden, which I think is translated. La Prostitution is not translated. and Tomb for 500,000 Soldiers, which is about the Algerian struggles. Yeah, and this is very interesting in the sense where we're talking about right now, this whole notion of the decolonization and language, the processes, right? Very, very interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, he's one of the best. Yeah, Guillotin. Yeah.
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 No, he said the major thing that Nariri...
He put a tent up next to Versailles, by the way, and Lyotard and all the philosophers would go visit him every day. You know, it was his statement about the homeless in Paris. Yeah, but anyway, go ahead. What about New
Yeah. I mean, he like his major thing was to get rid of tribalism and move into socialism. You know,
Right, sure.
The Kenyan leader, right? The Nyerere. Was he Kenyan or
No, he was Tanzanian.
Tanzania.
Oh, the Kenyan, because I was like, the Kenyan was more kind of
Concilians.
conservative.
Yeah. Kumra.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he said
Kwame Nkrumah.
Nariri was like, okay, you know, we've got to get rid of the chiefs
Yeah.
and
Right.
move towards, you know,
And
socialism.
he was murdered, right, by the military coup or something?
No. Actually, he oddly enough, he decided also to.
Arjo, put your shoulders back. I'm feeling it. I mean, I'm telling you, man. I'm feeling it.
You know.
I mean, he gave up power. He actually resigned at a certain point, and he said, "Yeah, I want to resign while I
I feel the fabric even going back. You know, taking
You
care
need
of the
chemistry.
hunchback.
See,
I see.
it goes
I
like
feel
that.
it. I
That's
feel
the
it like
problem.
this, man. I'm telling
You
you.
need
I feel it.
chemistry.
Yeah. I mean, you're going to get strong. I'm telling you. I'll start my personal training this week. You know,
Yeah, he said, "I want to get out of this. You know, I want to stop while I still have all my senses."
Right. Good. Yeah, that's
And,
good.
That's pretty good. I mean,
Yeah,
he wasn't
and-
tainted by the.
Yeah, and also, I mean, in the way he went about it initially, because the guy thought that maybe he thought he was going to come back after
Right.
a period of being away, you know, but it didn't work out so well.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you know, because the other thing that he did was when in the initial decolonization period, you know, he became the president, and then he resigned to basically
I
work
knew
on
it
the
was
party,
brought
to
up.
work
Everybody
on
was gonna-
education
Thank you. Oh, that's too
within,
many. Okay.
you know, within the Revolutionary Party. And then he became president again. And they thought, this guy thought, he said, yeah, he thinks Nyerere maybe thought that he was going to go back to the party and then come back again as leader. But then he realized that when he went out to the party again, that the party was in a shambles. But I'll send a link out. It's
Interesting, huh?
yeah, it's quite interesting, I
Yeah.
think.
Good. Okay, let's go back down 322, because again, what he's setting up here, inauthentic waiting, right, versus resolute anticipation. Then he's making a play on waiting on Godot, if you will, very early. You can see where a lot of this theater of the absurd comes from, as well as the resolute anticipatoriness. And he goes through moment and now. You got to leave today?
I
What's the matter with
I
you?
got parent duties today.
Oh, okay.
You know.
You know,
I'm a
Parents
true
comes from
dinosaur, so
Pelias.
I've been researching dinosaurs like for the first time in my life, like
who's your
Cretaceous
favorite?
period.
Who's your favorite?
My favorite is the Troodon.
Oh, yeah.
Who's that?
Troodon is like a medium-sized, kind of smallish predator.
Yeah, very
But
fast.
had eyes that were forward-looking.
Right.
So that was an advantage. And it used cunning in addition to. So it wasn't like a brute power kind of T-Rex. It was more like a
Stegosaurus.
Well, they had armor.
Right.
They
What
were,
was
you
the
know,
one
yeah.
in Jurassic
So
Park?
The raptor?
I've been
raptor.
learning
I
a
like
lot about
those.
the dinosaurs. You know?
The raptor has an eye on the side
I don't know, but they were vicious. That's why I like
Which
them.
ones,
The
the-
raptors.
Oh, God.
from the movie.
Or the pterodactyl birds. I mean, you know.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Watch out for the rhino.
But I think after about 2 weeks or so, things should get more.
Okay. And how are you for Saturdays if we do this thing with Rachel?
I should be good. I mean,
Sunday. I mean,
not the
sorry.
next week
Okay.
or so, but after that,
Cool.
yeah.
Okay.
It's just this week and next week a little bit more.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay. I'll be in touch. Yeah, I'll see you this week probably.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
See you later.
So anyway, going down, and we'll get to the. I mean, the great thing you're missing, Arto, is the Aristotle, but you read it, right? You're missing the Aristotle.
And also the beginning, right, of the metaphysics. What does it mean to wonder?
Yes, but this is about
What is
fear,
meaning?
Oh,
and
the
this is
fear.
very important. Page 326. Okay, so when you get home and get a break from the dinosaurs, reread page 326 carefully. Yeah.
Cheerful.
Okay. All right. But it would not temporalize itself, bottom of page 322, if it were not temporal, that is, equiprimordial, determined by having been and the present. That way, the way in which the ecstasy of the present co-constitutes inauthentic understanding was already made roughly clear. Every day taking care of things understands itself in terms of the potentiality of being that confronts it as coming from its possible success or failure to what is actually taken care of. Now, what does this describe? Profit and loss. Right? I mean, think about it. I
Right.
mean, you know, what's really going on here in everyday life. Winners and losers, right? Corresponding to the inauthentic future, it has its own way of being together with what is taken care of. The ecstatic mode of this present reveals itself if we adduce, for comparison, the very same ecstasy, but in the mode of authentic temporality. To the anticipation of resoluteness, there belongs a present in accord with which a resolution discloses the situation. In resoluteness, the present is not only brought back from the dispersion in what is taken care of closest at hand, but is held in the future and the having been. We call the present, but it's held in authentic temporality and is thus authentic, the moment. Okay? This is very important, right? The moment.
Mm-hmm.
This term must be understood in the active sense as an ecstasy. It means the resolute raptness of Dasein in what is encountered as possibilities and circumstances to be taken care of in the situation. But this rapture is held in resoluteness. The phenomena of the moment can, in principle, not be clarified in terms of the now. The now is a temporal phenomena that belongs to time as within timeness. The now in which something comes into being passes away, but as an objectively present. In the moment, nothing can happen. But as an authentic present, it lets us encounter for the first time what can be in a time, as something at hand or objectively present. Okay? In contrast to the moment, this is very good about its temporality. I mean, I think this is crucial for an understanding when we say, what is the moment? There was a moment.
Mm-hmm.
The authentic present, we shall call the inauthentic present making present. Understood formally, every present makes present, but not every present is in the moment. When we use the expression making present with no additional qualification, we always mean the inauthentic kind, which is irresolute and lacking the moment. Making present will become clear only in terms of the temporal interpretation of falling prey to the world taken care of. This falling prey has its existential meaning in making present. But since an authentic understanding projects its potentiality of being in terms of what can be taken care of, this means that it temporalizes itself in terms of making present. The moment, on the other hand, temporalizes itself out of the authentic future. So the Augenblick, which is this authentic moment, actually constitutes authentic being in the world, right? You have to have that encounter of that organ blick. Yeah? Yeah. So, I'm not going to read the rest of this. Then you have the temporality of attunement. And let's turn to page 326. This is on the affective fear. Aristotle correctly defines fear. This is about 8 lines down. Or anyway, let me go up the page a little bit. You see about 10 lines down, awaiting, obviously, awaiting is italicized.
Mm-hmm.
Awaiting obviously also belongs to the existential and temporal constitution of fear. But this initially means only that the temporality of fear is inauthentic. Is the fear of merely the expectation of something futurely threatening? The expectation of something futurely threatening need not already be fear, and it is so far from being fear that it lacks the specific mood character of fear. In fear, the awaiting of fear lets what is threatening come back to one's potentiality of being factually taking care of things. Only of that to which this comes back is already ecstatically open. Can what is threatening be awaited back to the being I am? And only thus can design be threatened. The character of the mood and the affect of fear lies in the fact that the awaiting that fears is less afraid for itself, that is, fear of is a fearing about. The existential and temporal meaning of fear is constituted by a self-forgetting, the confused backing away from one's own factical potentiality of being, which is threatened being in the world, taking care of what is at hand. Aristotle correctly defines fear as luntiness, tyranny, right, as depression or confusion. Depression faces or forces design back out of its thrownness, but in such a way that its thrownness is precisely closed off. Confusion is based upon forgetting. When one forgets and backs away from a factical, resolute potential of being, one keeps to these possibilities of self-preservation and evasion that have already been circumspectly discovered beforehand. Taking care, which fears for itself, leaps from one thing to the other because it forgets itself and thus cannot take hold of any definite possibility. Fear makes you, and think about this in terms of union struggles or left struggles out there, how this plays out. All possible possibilities offer themselves, and that means impossible ones too. One who fears for oneself stops at none of these. The surrounding world does not disappear, but one encounters it in the mode of no longer knowing one's way around in it. And this is what management's doing in terms of chaos in workplaces. I mean, this is very clear to my mind what's coming down. Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking more about it as like internet culture, actually.
Well, it is, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No one knows anything. Specifically, you're jumping around on every issue. Yeah.
Surfing the
exactly.
web. Yeah.
No way around the world anymore.
No ability
Fear
to
is
really know
constituted.
what to even search for because the understanding is lacking. No ability to question source. Right?
Yeah.
This is another one. No structures of evaluation. These are very, very important lacks that are going on.
You don't know the way around the world anymore, and in fact, like the millennial generation I read recently is the most susceptible generation to getting scammed, actually.
Oh, well, that's a career for us.
Getting scammed?
Yeah, scammers, yeah. Which is interesting, right? Because you have this internet culture
Right.
that has no bearing in the world anymore.
Right. Excuse me. No, sorry. Definitely. The internet's a great example here. Also, but how management uses chaos, in the workplace to create confusion constantly,
That's
and
true,
how
too.
that plays into fear. How campaigns of disinformation work and misinformation. I'm looking at this in terms of structural movement as well.
Yeah.
how this works. It worked here very well, and these people aren't that smart that pulled it off here. I mean, that's the real idiocy is beyond me. How faculty could fall for this.
Fall for.
All the disinformation, all the confusion, all this, preying upon, fear, confusion, considering confusion all the time.
Yeah, well, that's what's going on with all this Russia crap,
Yeah, well, that's another
That's
thing
true. That's
on
another
a
point,
higher
yeah.
level. Yeah, I'm talking about the confusion about a contract, what a union is about, who benefits, who doesn't benefit, what the principles are. Just total confusion that played into the worst fears that people have. And depression, and inability to act. What this really does is foreclose action. That's what he's really talking about.
Yeah.
That authenticity here is this is a foreclosure, if you will, of action. Yeah. So anyway,
It's interesting.
yeah, and this is what Aristotle's talking about as well. That fear leads to depression and confusion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because you're living in a strategy of fear management. Very good book, by the way, by Paul Virillo called The Administration of Fear. You know it?
Yeah, we read that one.
Yeah. It's a very good book, The Administration of Fear, on this line, on this level. It was very Heideggerian, by the way, Virillo. Very, very much out of this, yeah.
I mean, that's another thing about Generation Z, right? Depressed and confused.
You're not calling them
Sums
Z
it-
yet? You haven't
Oh yeah,
given
Z.
them the official
Yeah.
designation.
It's like a perfect description, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, they have
Everybody's
money. They have money.
Yeah.
So the money anxiety is not really there, right? Because they're conditioned into thinking that way. But yes, all the rest is complete confusion and lack of understanding, and an arrogance that goes with this. Yeah. Yeah. But not everybody has the money. I mean, that's another thing.
Yeah, a lot of student debt.
Yeah.
Yeah, although I don't know, I'm not quite so bought into that, in a way, that because I mean, in a sense, sort of the TV generation.
Yeah, they
I
had that
think,
too. Yeah.
Was actually even more confused.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
No,
at least
I
it
mean,
starts there, yeah.
Because at least, the internet has got so much crap in it, but, it's still an interactive medium.
Well,
Whereas-
TV was interactive too, because we would sit and criticize, and look at constructions of shows and all
Oh,
this.
sure.
You would engage in that kind of critique constantly.
Oh, yeah.
But the thing about TV, in a way, I mean, yes, it can be solitary, but in a lot of ways it was a group phenomena, right? You would sit around with a bunch of friends, watch a program,
Get stoned.
get stoned. You would break it down.
Yeah.
You know what I mean.
Yeah.
It became part of a small, for lack of a better term, a community, right? Right?
Yeah.
But
yeah.
on the other hand, the internet, in a way, or the screen culture. I mean, the screen is certainly there from the movies to TV, etc. But now this screen culture has created a new kind of atomism and isolation, of which there's no critique really going on when one is surfing, right? It's all, quote, overloaded information flow, right? In a sense, for a lot of people. Unless you know exactly where to go, Yeah.
Yeah.
And how to read. That's another thing. The TV generation still know how to read somewhat.
Really?
Well, I don't know. I do. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I mean, yeah. But I mean, I hear what you're saying. I mean, I just think it's gotten much, yeah. I mean, I had look. Where do we get the interest for wanting to know about the New Deal, the 30s, what preceded us historically, to be able to read certain repetitions in history? Where did this desire? How was this desire activated? These people today, this generation Z, whatever, there's there's no curiosity. This is part of the problem. At least we had intellectual curiosity. I mean, Maybe, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just speaking from a particular, group of or set of people, but yeah, because I mean,
Yeah. But there are intellectually curious Generation Z people
Sure.
out there.
There what? I'm sorry?
I said there are, intellectually curious Generation Z people out there,
Yeah, maybe so, but I mean, it's not really a cultural import, like it was of cultural import like it was 40, 50 years ago, at least from what I can tell. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but
Yeah, no, I think you were right. There was a period there, in the late '60s, early '70s, when there was,
right.
When we used to watch Dragnet and just make fun of it, But I also don't think, I think there's a different, it just happens differently, and I don't think
Well,
it's.
I personally, I think, I mean, I've given this a lot of thought. I mean, I may, I'm not saying it's it's universal, but I think what's really lacking today is this: the dialogic. You no longer have dialogical imagination and dialogical encounters. It's very, very strange if you get one, in a sense. Everything else is about, did you hear this? It's gossip, it's chatter, and it's information. We live in the age of the information bomb, to use another metaphor here. So this is being overtaken by chatter, gossip, misinformation, disinformation, information bombing constantly. This is the thing that I sort of lament, if you will, or put it in neutral language, right? Right. And how do you build a movement without having this alongside of this, right? With the care, with the Zorga as a foundation. How do you really build a movement, right? A political movement. How do you have a polis that's only based on, this is what I'm going to do for your taxes. This is what I'm going to do for this, et cetera, et cetera. Because that's what it's come down to, is that, the Marxist thing, rational choice theory, analytical Marxism, and rational choice. And this is what people begin to get, in a sense. So all of this is lost in that, where you can really have a conversation, and where the, quote, meaning comes back. I'm not saying that we have ultimate meaning. This is not my point. My point is that you begin to have a conversation, right? You really are able to speak around and with, in a sense. And it's very, very rare that you get this in terms of, I mean, that's my point about the screen culture, which is a new mode of production, too. As our friend Arto knows, Von Zotz has, been working on, that the screen culture is a new mode of production. It's what Fordism is, what Fordism was to the 20s up until the 50s. The screen is the new Fordism in my it's the post-Fordist moment. Yeah. So I mean, I agree. I mean, I grew up with a lot of dumb people too, and I liked Eddie Haskell, and everybody else liked the Beaver, and and I was always good with Mrs. Cleaver, and and we had terms for a lot of our friends, and etc. Yeah. What would you like?
A TV show made a character after Rachel.
Which one?
Specifically.
Who's that?
What's the show called?
High Maintenance.
It's a show called High Maintenance. There's a character on there that looks like
Are you
her,
the
except she's
person-
white.
Are you the person high maintenance, and then are you the reference?
Apparently, I am. I
Oh, wow.
found out today.
Someone sent her a message.
So you're considered high maintenance?
What's she?
No. I think
No, I'm
her.
just wondering
I
how
think it's
the
her
title of-
husband, actually.
The husband is the
I
high
think it is,
maintenance
yeah.
one? Okay, yeah, fair enough. Okay, that's good.
The husband stays home and smokes
Oh, it's that
weed
show.
all the time. Yeah.
Oh, that's what the high maintenance is
Yeah.
about. I see.
That's funny.
Does he cook?
I don't know. I've
Does he
never
do the
watched it,
household
but someone
stuff?
just sent me a video today where they're like talking to her and she's wearing Rachel Comey, and they're like, you should have Rachel go send you to Morocco. They have great textiles. And then she goes like, Oh no, I think
They
she's
got
gonna
better
send me
good
to
things in
LA.
Morocco than textiles, believe me.
I don't know how it relates though. TV.
Wait, just you're a TV character now. I think that's funny.
Okay, well.
Nobody
Okay.
cares.
So, I mean, look, the question here for Heidegger, again, is that, somehow fear, right,
Yeah.
is connected to confusion and depression.
Yeah.
And this is what's played on by the system, and we can see this in inauthentic modes of being.
Mm-hmm.
And this to me, I was told by a good friend of mine who I respect deeply, who's a very good Nietzsche scholar, that I shouldn't use language like the politics of inauthenticity or authenticity. Well, I think it's crucial we do that, because in a certain way, we have to begin to think again in those kind of, outside just structure. We have to think agency as well. What does agency really mean today? Yeah, yeah. Who are the revolutionary subjects? What is the revolutionary position? These are the kind of things I think we need to think, in a lot of ways. More than ever. Yeah, the time, more than ever. So, anyway, this is a very good section. I mean, okay, so taking care leaps from one thing to the other. There's a term too, there's another term, Pascalian diversion, right? That you're always diverted to something else, right? This is Pascal, who did this in the pensées, in the thinking, in the thoughts, in his great little book of fragments, the diversion. We always think of diversions to do, Yeah, where are the diversions? All right, so he goes on. One who fears for oneself stops at none of these. The surrounding world does not disappear when one encourages it in the mode of no longer knowing one's way around in it. Yeah? And this is what happens. This is, again, I mean, I know I keep using these LIU examples, but to me, this is what occurred, at least phenomenologically, in this contract debacle, that people, just didn't know where they were. Mm-hmm. So I want to be rid of this. I want to be rid of my anxiety about this. I want to be inauthentic. I'm going to vote for an awful contract, and we're going to go on, And this took away any kind of pain of struggle, any kind of authenticity, and any kind of movement. And this is what occurs. And this happens in many, many things across the United States. Yeah. Look at the British strike, too. Now these leaders that are talking, after the fact, where they basically signed a contract, the same thing, before they went out 2 weeks earlier. How does this happen? This has a lot of relations, I think, to labor struggles, this kind of stuff. So we could learn from this too. All right. Thus, for example, it is known that the inhabitants of a burning house often save the most unimportant things nearby. When one has forgotten oneself and makes present a jumble of unattached possibilities, one thus makes possible the confusion that constitutes the nature or the mood of fear. The forgetfulness of confusion also modifies awakening and characterizes a depressed or confused awaiting that is different from pure expectation. So again, the tension here is between resolute anticipation, right, and a kind of inauthentic, unresolved, dominated by fear, awaiting, right, and expectation. The specific ecstatic unity that makes fearing for oneself existentially possible temporalizes itself primarily out of the forgetting. We describe that as a mode of having been modifies its presence in the future in its temporalizing. The temporality of fear is a forgetting that awaits, very, very important here, that awaits and makes present. In accordance with its orientation towards things encountered in the world, the common sense interpretation of fear initially seeks to determine the approaching evil. Oh boy, here it comes, Miss Dr. Klein, right? The approaching evil here at LIU. Of what it is afraid of, and to define its relation to that evil as expectation. What belongs to the phenomena beyond that remains a feeling of pleasure or pain. How is the temporality, and this is the next part here, very important part, how is the temporality of anxiety related to that of fear? We call the phenomena of anxiety a fundamental attunement. Okay? A fundamental attunement. And this is in section 40, by the way, for those of you reading the footnotes. It brings Dasein before its own most thrownness and reveals the uncanniness of the everyday, familiar being in the world. So this is the unheimlich, the uncanny in Freud, and the uncanny not being at home, moment for Heidegger. Where you're thrown, you're sort of displaced, you're thinking otherwise. The Russians have the term ostronomy, which meant defamiliarization. You are defamiliarized from your familiar way of being. In many ways. Okay? Just like fear, anxiety is formally determined by something in the face of which one is anxious into something about which one is anxious. However, our analysis showed that these two phenomena do coincide, right? This is not supposed to mean that their structural characteristics, and this is important, are fused, right? As if anxiety were anxious in the face of anything nor about anything, right? That, in the face of which and the about which coincide, means that the being exhibiting these structures in the same, namely Dasein. In particular, that in the face of which one has anxiety is not encountered as something definite to be taken care of, the threat, and remember, it's indefinite, it's not definite, right? Very, very important. The threat does not come from something at hand and objectively present, but rather from the fact that everything at hand and objectively present absolutely has nothing more to say to us. Right? Nothing more to say to us. Beings in the surrounding world are no longer relevant. The world in which I exist has sunk into insignificance, and the world thus disclosed can set free only beings as having the character of irrelevance. The nothingness of the world, in the face of which anxiety is anxious, does not mean that an absence of inner worldly things objectively present is experienced in anxiety. They must be encountered in just such a way that they are of no relevance whatsoever, but can show themselves in a barren mercilessness. However, this means that our heedful awaiting finds nothing in terms of which it could understand itself. It grasps at the nothingness of the world, but thrust towards the world, understanding is brought by anxiety to being in the world as such. Being in the world is both what anxiety is anxious in the face of and what it is anxious about. Being anxious in the face of neither has the nature of an expectation nor of an awaiting at all. That in the face of which one has anxiety is, after all, already there. It is Dasein itself. Does this not mean that anxiety is constituted by a future? Certainly. Yet, and this is again important, certainly not by the inauthentic use or one of awaiting. Right? The insignificance of the world, right, disclosed in anxiety, reveals the nullity of what can be taken care of. That is, the impossibility of projecting oneself upon a potentiality being primarily based upon which is taken care of. But the revelation of this impossibility means to let the possibility of an authentic potentiality of being shine forth. What is the temporal meaning of this revealing? Anxiety is anxious about naked Dasein thrown into uncanniness. It brings one back to the sheer that of one's own most individuated thrownness. This bringing back has neither the character of an evasive forgetting nor that of a remembering. But neither does anxiety imply that one has already taken over one's existence in resolution and is retrieving it. On the contrary, anxiety brings one back to thrownness as something to be possibly repeated, and thus it also reveals the possibility of an authentic potentiality being that must, as something futural in repetition, come back to the throne there. Bringing before the possibility of repetition is the specific, ecstatic mode of the attunement of the having been that constitutes anxiety. And this is beginning to show the structural characteristics of anxiety not fused with fear. Okay? The forgetting constitutive for fear confuses Dasein and let it stray back and forth between ungrasped worldly possibilities. In contrast to this frantic making present, the present of anxiety is maintained in bringing oneself back to one's own most thrownness. In accordance with its existential meaning, anxiety cannot lose itself in what can be taken care of. If something like this happens in an attunement similar to that, this is fear, which everyday understanding mixes up with anxiety. Although the present of anxiety is maintained, it does not as yet have the character of the moment that temporalizes itself in resolution. Anxiety only brings one into the mood, right? Into the mood, important, for a possible resolution. The present of anxiety holds the moment in readiness, as which it, and only it, is possible. In the particular temporality of anxiety, that it is primordially grounded in having been, and that out of it future and present temporalizes themselves, the possibility was shown of the powerlessness that distinguishes the mood of anxiety. In it, Dasein is taken back fully to its naked uncanniness and stunned by it. But this feeling of being stunned not only takes Dasein back from its worldly possibilities, but at the same time gives it the possibility of an authentic potentiality of being. Yet neither of these moods, fear and anxiety, ever occurs just isolated in the stream of experience, but always attunes an understanding of it, or is attuned by it. Fear is occasioned by beings taken care of in the surrounding world. In contrast, anxiety arises from Dasein itself. Okay? The inner and the outer is working here, obviously, right? I mean, this is what he's talking about. Fear is from the outside. The inside out is obviously the anxiety. Fear comes from us, from inner worldly beings. Anxiety arises from being in the world as thrown, being towards death. Understood temporally, this arising of anxiety from Dasein means that the future and the present of anxiety temporalize themselves out of a primordial having been, in the sense of bringing us back to the possibility of repetition. But anxiety can rise authentically only in a resolute Dasein. Once again, one who is resolute knows no fear, but understands the possibility of anxiety as the mood that does not hinder and confuse him. This is, again, crucial to remember, right? I'll repeat that. Anxiety can arise authentically only in a resolute Dasein. One who is resolute knows no fear, but understands the possibility of anxiety as the mood that does not hinder and confuse him. Anxiety frees one. Interesting, right? The choice of word. Frees one from nullifying possibilities and lets one become free for authentic possibilities. Any thoughts? Want to stop there for a second? This is the temporality of moods in general, but really, in a way, the crux of being towards death, the temporality of attunement, right? Anticipation and authenticity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Revolutionary, right?
Very revolutionary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is the revolutionary. Knows no fear. Yeah.
It is. The revolutionary knows no fear.
Yeah.
Right? Because of the resoluteness, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Towards the possibility
of death.
Yeah. At any moment, right? Yeah. He understands this
Critical.
very, very well.
Yeah.
Right? Never hinders nor confuses one. One becomes singular in one's approach, right? Resolute and singular.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Right? Okay? So, although both and the authentic possibilities, again, one is not authentic unless one is living somewhat without fear. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have fear or the antenna doesn't go up. I don't think he's saying that. But he's saying if you live in that moment of Dasein, of the fear, you're always searching for security. You're always risk averse. All these kind of things. You're more than 95%, under the sway of the dictatorship of the they, your bureaucratic consciousness, et cetera, et cetera. You can go through a whole typology here. Yeah, in a way. Okay? Although both modes of attunement, fear and anxiety, are primarily grounded in having been, their origin is different with regard to the temporalizing belonging to each in the totality of care. Right? Anxiety arouses for the future of resoluteness. Yeah? What will happen to me in the future? Where fear arises from the loss present, of which fear is fearly apprehensive, thus falling prey to it more than ever. I can't possibly fight in this contract struggle because I'm going to lose, pay. Right? I can't go on strike. I may lose my job. Right? In a certain way. You think about this, the having beenness, right? Versus that of the futural action and the risk. Again, I'm not trying to talk about unwarranted risks here, just taking risks, because that's what authenticity is. No, it's the resoluteness and the singularity within the structure of care that's really playing out here. Right? It's really playing out, yeah. I mean, to me, it's impossible that you have a figure like Malcolm X without care.
Sure, yeah.
Or a Patrice Lumumba, or for that matter, a Dr. King, a Fred Hampton. You can go through the list. Che Guevara, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what I was saying last night about the Dr. King speech when he finally talks about class.
Right.
And he gets killed. He's
exactly.
resolute in that moment.
Exactly. He's resolute in that moment. And you saw the movie recently. You can see the transformation that Pontecorvo pulls off in Jose Dolores's,
Oh, yeah, of course.
face.
Yeah.
First of all, he's fearful of even reaching for the gun to kill the man that, is going to take the gold, the Portuguese soldier, right? And he kills him. You begin to see a little bit of a transformation.
Yeah.
And you begin to see the future starting to emerge instead of the having beenness of the fear in that kind of situation. Right? I'm angry, but I've never been able to kill. But now, with resoluteness, I know how to, do this, and I understand the enemy. This is they saw I'm just using this. You've seen Burn by Gillo Pontecorvo? Long time ago, yeah. It's a memorable movie, though, Phil.
Yeah.
You never seen it, Sean?
No, it's great. Yeah, it's a great movie.
Marlon Brando's amazing, too. Now, he's resolute in maintenance. And he's not really afraid either.
In a different
this
way,
is a kind of different way at work in terms of the colonizer and the colonized.
Yeah.
Right? A very
Both
interesting
resolute.
dialectic that's going on in the film. Yeah.
Although he's less resolute. Well, maybe you can't quantify.
Well, I don't know if you should grade him that way. I think he's resolute in what he represents.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
At that moment,
Yeah.
which is English imperialism.
Yeah.
The royal sugar.
Well, and maybe he's not. He gets killed at the end, too. So.
Well, but he's I mean,
Yeah.
no, he gets killed. He gets killed in a moment of ecstasy.
Yeah.
He thinks he's hearing his friend's voice, right?
Yeah.
And then he gets hit in the gut, right?
Great movie.
All right. So, but is not the thesis of the temporality of moods perhaps valid only for the phenomena? How is the temporal meaning to be found in the pallid lack of mood that dominates the gray every day? Those without affect, right? Generation. What do they call that generation? The what was that stupid thing? That film, the X-Files, Generation X, right? Right? Affectless.
That's kind of true, actually.
Right? Right? The gray every day. I like that metaphor. The gray every day. Right?
That's a good point.
And how about the temporality of moods and effects such as hope, joy, enthusiasm, gaiety? As soon as we mention phenomena such as weariness, sadness, melancholy, and despair, it becomes clear that not only fear and anxiety are founded existentially and having been, but other moods are there as well. However, these must be interpreted on the broader basis of a developed existential analytic of the time. But even such a phenomenon as hope, which seems to be completely founded in the future, must be analyzed in a way similar to fear. In contrast to fear, which is related to a malum futurum, hope has been characterized as the expectation of a bonum. Yeah? So he sets up this opposition, hope and fear. The principle of hope and the administration of fear. Would be a very good long essay to kind of engage this. But what has been decisive for the structure of hope as a phenomenon is not so much the futural character of that to which it is related as the existential meaning of hoping itself, right? And this is interesting, how this existential meaning of hoping itself plays out. Right? I mean, this is what keeps us going. Walter Benjamin used to say, we have hope for those without hope. Mm. He said this about the radical. The radical, we have hope for those without hope. One who hopes takes oneself, so to speak, along in the hope and brings oneself towards what is hoped for. But that presupposes having achieved oneself. The fact that hope brings relief from depressing apprehensiveness only means that even this attunement remains related to a burden in the mode of having been. Elevated or elevating moods are ontologically possible only in an ecstatic temporal relation of Dasein to the throne ground of itself. The pallid lack of mood, of complete indifference, which clings to nothing and urges to nothing, and which goes along with what the day brings, yet in a way takes everything with it, demonstrates in the most penetrating fashion the power of forgetting in the everyday moves of taking care of what is nearby, just barely living, which lets everything alone as it is grounded in giving oneself over to thrownness and forgiving. It has the ecstatic meaning of an inauthentic having been indifference, which can go along with falling over oneself with busyness. New York, constantly, everybody in a rush, is to be sharply distinguished from equanimity. This mood arises from the resoluteness that, in the moment, has its view to the possible situations of the potentiality of being whole disclosed in the anticipation of death. Only beings that in accordance with the meaning of their being are attuned, that is, beings which is existing, have in each instance already been and exist in a constant mode of having been, can be affected. Ontologically, affection presupposes making present in such a way that in it Dasein can be brought back to itself as having been. How the stimulation and touching of the senses and beings that are simply alive are to be ontologically defined. For example, how and where in general the being of animals is constituted by a time remains a problem for itself. So we're going to have to ask Lucky that question. Okay? So this ends this. Then, not only the primary understanding and attunement, he's going to, he started this section on understanding. We skipped that attunement to go to
good
fear.
Definition.
So good definition, and you can take this back to the sections on understanding and begin to read this text. I mean, another strategy of reading this text is to read it analogically, where you begin to go back to sections of where this is still built with, the being, the existential analytic, then to the temporality. What is understanding? What is falling prey? What is the addictogenic?
Right.
All of these kind of things. And he goes through this very, very well. You begin to see the structure of the text in a very different way. Okay? So the falling prey, I guess the arising of the present, the throw of being, this is the throw of being thrown in the attune. Then the temporality of discourse. You had a question? Yeah, please.
Do you think that this section, is this in some sense like towards active forgetting, like the Nietzschean active forgetting?
Which one? What section?
Like, the section where he talks about forgetting. I mean, he's quite pessimistic about forgetting, whereas I feel like in Nietzsche, it's this active forgetting is like an overcoming thing, right?
It is an overcoming thing, but the active forgetting, for Heidegger, would be in the temporal ecstasis is authenticity.
As authenticity.
The resoluteness would
Yeah.
be part of the active forgetting.
I see. So you just changed
the
the term
active
a little bit.
in a certain way. Yeah, no, he's not trying to. I
Yeah.
mean, I think they're on a very similar page here
Right,
in
exactly.
some ways.
Just the
Although some
terminology
people will
is a little
talk about that Heidegger is, I mean, again, look, we have a play throughout this book that demands a lot of attention. Obviously, is the question between neme, right, and mnemotechnics, and the act of forgetting, right?
Mhm.
And this seems to be something always going on. So in Nietzsche, in terms of memory and anamnesis, as we know from the historical work, has the two moments, the antiquarian and the monumental,
Right.
are both part of the having beenness and the past and how we do the archive, right? So say I do a course on Marx, we're going to go back through the past, right? We're going to read the 1844 manuscripts and try to situate them. We'll do so temporally from 1844 in Paris when he constructs them. What is he trying to settle accounts with? Then as you move forward, 1932 when they're discovered, the effect they have on the society, all of these things, right? And this is all part of a historical materialism and also what Nietzsche would call the monumental, in this regard. And Heidegger's doing a bit of the antiquarian by footnoting Aristotle on fear in terms of the rhetorical, right? The rhetoric and the rhetoric of fear. Aristotle. So it's a great book to read. It's the Aristotle Rhetoric.
Yeah, I'm gonna check
To
that
think
out.
it through. I mean, it's a great text to recapture and think through. All right, because it's really about how civil society and discourse operate. Right? That, alongside the philosophy of right of Hegel, are two of the most fundamental books about civic discourse, in my opinion. Yeah. So, but anyway, let's go back to this. So the other one, the forgetting, in a way, for Heidegger, since it's futural and it's anxiety, the forgetting is going on. Anxiety is happening in an active way, right? I mean, if you're authentic about this, right? When you're resoluteness, you begin to have that naked encounter, if you will, with the uncanniness, with the uncanny.
Right.
Okay? Yeah. So there is that forgetting going on. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
I see your point.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it is going on. In
Yeah.
Nietzsche, however, it's this past that bogs us down, right? That doesn't allow us to get to the moment of the critical history.
I get it.
Right? I mean, I'm trying to, just make some similarities here.
Get to the
Yeah.
clearing.
Now the question is can you make a departure without the trace? This is the political question that, say, Derrida asks. Can the new Übermensch, if you will, right, leave this without leaving a trace? What does this mean? Without leaving a trace, right? Right? It's this active forgetfulness, right? Now for Deleuze, and this is problematic, very problematic. I mean, I'm just trying to go forward here, just to say there are many codes working here. Deleuze will say that the nomadic thought is always jamming codes, and that's what active forgettingness is about. That's a political move. You're always in movement, jamming the codes. So it can never be codified, typed, pinned down, all these kind of things. It's never a position that you have, it's always positions and they're varying, right? In a sense.
Okay.
So you begin to get this without leaving the trace. Yeah, in a way, right?
Yeah.
And this becomes the production, if you will, of neologisms, the new language. You could talk about this going back to what we were talking about earlier, about the language of colonialism and the overcoming of this by the vernacular. Yeah. So these are interesting, parameters in which you can begin to talk. Cargo ship language. You have the, many cargo cult. You have many languages down south. There's certain expression. The vernacular. How does the vernacular play out in history? Is it jamming codes, right, etc. How do you get there? So Jean Genet, for example, will talk about the black, language in history in the United States, right? And that, this is a language that needs to be taken back, taken up, against the dominant language of imperialism. So this all became a question of codes, of what codes are going to be jammed. So since you brought it up, so
Yeah.
memory hurts you.
Yeah.
in this context, right?
In Deleuze's context, essentially.
Well, in both Derrida and Deleuze, in a sense.
Yeah.
However, you have to know what you're overcoming. Right,
Yeah.
that's another thing. This is a very, very, thin line. There's no either or at work here. There's always this movement of the both and.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you can get there, right? Yeah.
Do you think that the jamming of the codes is only constituted in the negative sense, though?
I don't think Nietzsche jams all the codes, personally.
Yeah.
I think Nietzsche remains in terms of a codification. I think he can be
Right.
brought back in. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this was another thing that madness jams all the codes.
Right.
This was Lang and Cooper, etc. So what? In a way. I mean, does the man have the ability to act in terms of anticipatory resoluteness? No, no. Are you
Right.
building revolutionary subjects, or you're building a new class of warrior hyphen intellects, right? In some ways, right? Yeah. So I mean, these are I think very legitimate questions. See, a Junger would say, in The Worker or in some of his other works, that this Nietzschean man is the one who overcomes pain, and memory and pain are connected. The having business and the pain that is being overcome. You would see this in music in terms of the arts. We've talked a little bit about this, breakthroughs by Berg and Schoenberg, if you will, with atonal music and
Right.
12-tone systems, and where do you go with that, and what's being jammed between bebop and progressive, and what does one do to Parker to get to the next level of say a Coltrane, or what does one do to Gillespie to get to the level of a Miles, and what's happening in those moments in artistic expression. Yeah. Whereas why is Picasso maybe not technically as good as Matisse, right? In some ways, but is at least able to embrace, the quote unquote what was then called the primitive, right? And incorporate it into his art, and you can see a dialectical movement in him, whereas in Matisse you're almost static in a certain way in his growth. I mean, just some questions I have. I mean, I'm just throwing out, examples. So, I mean, this is a perpetual question, really, in a sense. Is memory good for you? Is too much memory good for you, or is it bad for you?
Yeah.
And what is this active forgetting? And we're all selective in this. I mean, we have active forgetfulness
Sure.
in so many ways. I mean, this is also another thing. The question really here is not just the forgetting. It's the activity, right? The active forgetting as an act of. And I think
How
Heidegger
constant.
and Nietzsche have this in common. And it's an act of. One is anticipatory resoluteness, of the having beenness into the future and understanding one's thrownness. And the other, it might be, overcoming the monumental and the antiquarian. I mean, Nietzsche wants a new sea, a new horizon, right? As does Heidegger. I mean, these are dangerous thinkers.
Yeah.
In the creative sense, create dangerously is the motto, always. Yeah,
That's helpful.
yeah. Is that? I mean, yeah, in a way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, the enemy for every major philosopher was always inertia. Keep that in mind. Stasis and inertia is always the enemy for any philosopher, including Kant, who's a revolutionary to a degree. For his time, yeah. Despite some people's saying that he's a white supremacist and whatever other nonsense we come up with about this.
So Critique of Pure Reason is worth reading.
Well, it's worth. Yeah, I mean the way to read the Critique of Pure Reason, at least in my, you look at the architectonic. Yeah, it's worth reading, of course. I mean, you're in processes of thought.
Right.
I mean that's kind of the thing. It's a training for the mind. I mean, really, in a sense, yeah. Not that you're going to come out, feeling totally whole. You may be even confused in some sections, but yeah. But the architectonic's interesting. I think a good starting point with Kant would be the critique of judgment, the third critique,
Aesthetic.
where you look at the aesthetic experience. Yeah, read the third critique first. Yeah.
It's confusing, though. I mean,
Well, yes. I'm sorry. Well, yes, of course it's
That's a tough book, yeah.
These guys are all confused. As Ezra Pound said, confusion is the source of renewal. Yeah.
Thirdly, interpretive.
Right. 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 Yeah. I mean, you get the example of what is beauty, what is the sublime, what is the ugly, and also then he talks about the mathematical and the dynamic sublime. And one of the best people on the sublime is Jean-François Lyotard and this return to Kant. And I think when I do this Marx thing, I may take 1 week just to devote to this return to Kant in Marx, the Kantian Marxism.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I'll go through that with Caratani, Coletti, some other people, of course. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. I mean, you have the Hegelian Marxists, the Kantian, in philosophy, the Spinozas, the Althusserians, that are very much, taken by Spinoza. And Marx is a continuation of, nature naturing, in a sense. He understands this through the Epicurean. You have all these kind of, not only influences but schools that develop around these people in terms of trying to develop, problems. Yeah, and a lot to do with objects of inquiry too. So this is why this is kind of important as good background. I think it's very fundamental to do this, because the interesting thing about Heidegger in this book is you're dealing with the pedagogical, right? What is the future of the educational institutions to look like? The distinction between the fundamental ontology and the foundational, early on, right? But you've forgotten the questions of philosophy, very, very important. This question of going back and tracing it and rewriting the history of ontology. I mean, this is obviously the great ambition of this book. And, simultaneously, he's also, trying to deal with the problems of existence, everyday problems of existence. How are we habituated? How do we live? What is our there-ness? What is, this fear, anxiety, joy, all about, ultimately. So you have the existential analytic, the educational component, right? The philosophical conversation, dialogic, all working in one text, and ultimately thinking through time on another level, that's never been thought, where he confronts Hegel, Aristotle, and Bergson, the 3 major thinkers of time, in the history of this, right? Yeah. So it's in this regard, this is a very, to me, it's one of those books that's very much part of the pillars of modern philosophy. Yeah. Got a question? Yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of sort ofs today. Got to get more resolute.
Yeah. It's not like a very good question.
Yeah. No, it's okay. I mean, what's the
If you sort of take this project to completion in a way, and you get to direct intuition, it's essentially the end of philosophy in a way.
It is the end of philosophy. It's the task of thinking.
Right.
Yes. And he has a whole thing. The end of philosophy means the end, closure.
Yeah.
What you're dealing with here is a kind of closure. Mm-hmm. It's closing time. The curtain's down on the theater. These are the participants. This is what we're going to deal with, etc. That closure. We're working through it. Mm-hmm. We're beginning to deconstruct constantly, all these things. You're taking concepts and categories and you're deconstructing them, showing both their concept formation, where they came from, as well as how you can displace them into something else. And then there's this rewriting going on, which takes place first from the ground of the existential analytic, the Dasein. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's quite ambitious, what he took on. I mean, to put it mildly. I mean, this is a guy that said, I'm going to rewrite the entire history of being, right? To rewrite the whole history of ontology. I mean, he broke it, and, he basically broke the, the world here.
Amazing.
So, if you put this project to its conclusion, in some ways, the real question is, if you don't believe there's a hereafter, right? If Christianity or the other, religions that have reincarnation, transmigration, all these kind of things on, and this is the only life we have, and it's finite, and we begin to start from human finitude, and we begin to think about thrownness and our projects and that kind of experience, etc., it can be very liberating from, the bureaucracy of the everyday they self, from capitalism in a way. I know we have to still live under the system, and we know this, but at the same time, it can be tremendously liberatory. Yeah, in this way. So it could be a philosophy, if you will, of liberating oneself from the tediousness, the everydayness, the averageness, the incessant bureaucratization of everyday life, consumer controlled consumption, risk aversion, things, all of these moments. And it gives you, I think, a very different hearing and view of things. Yeah. Now, he doesn't come back to want to go back to the pre-Socratics. Or this is not written during the time period of when he's writing The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking. This is still early. He still believes he has produced the systematic treatise for the future. Right?
Yeah.
This is the book that begins, right? And then there are many, you can go through the career and you begin to see many levels. But again, this is a foundational text which has been studied, restudied, etc.
Yeah.
But if you look at, he's got 600 pages, there's more than this book just on the sophist, right? Just one dialogue of Plato.
It's crazy.
Yeah, on rhetoric, right? And what does it mean,
Yeah.
200 pages on Plato's theory of the truth, the essence of grounds, the principle of reason by Leibniz, right? Hegel's concept of experience, we could go back to this Erfahrung and Erlebnis to begin to think it through, So this is important stuff, we talk about, Badiou being his event. What is the event in Badiou? How would it be different than Heidegger's event? Again, how do the philosophers conceptualize it, and where are they standing when they conceptualize this?
Yeah.
When we talk about, here, homo datum, or some of the concepts we throw around that are kind of peculiar, if you will, to this room, right? What are we really elaborating, and from what position? And then how would that be out there? Vis-a-vis, authenticity, inauthenticity, anticipation, etc., etc. Yeah. Everywhere you go, you have the chip, on the card now.
Oh yeah.
You have the chip. That's the new language. You have the chip.
Yeah.
Right?
Insert or
What's your social? Think of the language in everyday life. How much, what kind of bastardization and diminution of existence all these things really have. What's your social? Prisoner 1, 2, 3, 6.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. So anyway, so this is so this is again a very important section. The falling prey about the non-lingering and curiosity, right? And then finally the temporality of discourse. He sums up on page 334. Temporalizing does not mean a succession of the ecstasies. The future is not later than the having been, and the having been is not earlier than the present. Temporality temporizes itself as a future that makes present in the process of the having been, The disclosiveness of the there and the fundamental existential possibilities of Dasein, authenticity and inauthenticity, are founded in temporality. But disclosiveness always pertains equiprimordially to the whole of being in the world, as well as the world. In orientation towards the temporal constitution of disclosiveness, we must able to demonstrate the ontological condition of the possibility that there can be beings that exist as beings in the world, right? This is very important. And then he'll go on to this category, which literally means to move beyond transcendence. Yeah, this new thing. And we've talked a little bit about this as the step back, too, so that you can see, what's near and what's far, It's a very interesting moment about the transcendence. But again, it's just not the future, right, as a new and after the now here. It's not the future at 5 o'clock, right? Western diabolical time. You like
Especially
that?
when they change it on you.
They did.
They don't do
didn't
that in Jamaica, you know that.
They don't. I'm glad to
No.
hear that.
No.
I can have the Blue Mountain coffee every day at the same
Same
time.
time.
I don't
Yeah.
have to
Yeah.
worry about
Set my
seasonal
watch.
setting
Yeah, they
clocks
don't
back and
steal
all
it
that.
from
Very
you.
good. We don't.
Yeah.
We didn't get the hour
Reckoning.
stealer stolen
Yeah.
away. Well, we get it back in
Reckoning.
October. Huh?
Ugh.
Yeah, we get it in autumn.
Get it back.
Taken away in spring
Talk
and,
about
and given
confusion.
back in autumn.
Yeah, well, that's because the sun goes down and comes up at the same time every day.
That's true too.
Hmm.
6:30.
It's earlier
Yeah,
now.
but
Huh?
but
I felt that light poured in this morning too, or way too early.
The
Given
day
my
was
sleeping
already-
patterns lately.
the days were already getting longer. It doesn't make any sense to me. Or
Yeah, they were beautiful as long as they were, right? Yeah, yeah, it's true.
I just.
Was it
daylight
7
savings
o'clock
time
now? We have
kills
daylight
me.
till 7?
Yeah, I think so.
Mhm. So anyway, this is what I'm thinking for maybe next week, and then we can go on to something else. Try to sum it up in some ways. You can bring questions. We can, if you want to read some passages, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the relationship to Adorno, right, and the Frankfurt School, and his, the presence in Marxism a little bit of Heidegger next week. Kind of give a short lecture, if you will, on that. And I don't think we really missed any sections in their totality. We pretty much covered, I think, almost everything.
And when you look back at it, you see all your notes in the book. It's pretty amazing, actually.
Well, I'm glad. I'm happy. Yeah.
But-
You can write the president of LIU a letter. Yeah.
I
We
will.
covered all of
Me
being
too.
in time on your grounds. Yeah. 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 I personally, I think, in the future, maybe we can certainly go back, and look at this again and talk about it, in a way. It's so fundamental,
Yeah.
I mean, to me, again, look, where we're situated, you have the masters of the modern consciousness. I mean, I took a course at Johns Hopkins that sort of changed, partially the way I think, called Makers of the Modern Mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this was a course that was built on Proust, Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Marx wasn't there, but of course I added Marx. So I raised my hand. Anyway, and Kafka. We read a few novelists, etc. But when you think about this, in philosophy, especially when you look at philosophy from the standpoint of the quote unquote Eurocentric tradition and the European Western rational from the Enlightenment forward and the critique against the Enlightenment, you have the three H's: Hegel, Heidegger, and Husserl. Right? There was a role in Heidegger in that succession. One who's the master thinker of the turn of the 19th century. The other two on the cusp, both of the 20th, and probably the master thinker, systematic thinkers of the 20th century. Then you have the three masters of suspicion. Who do not believe in systematicity ultimately and don't write systematically, except Marx certainly did in Capital, but he's one of the masters of suspicion that throws into question being becomes being as value, right? Being is not, and then you have to ask the question, what is value? We've forgotten the question of being, but then the question is, what is value? What is the form of value? Why such? How did we get to this? These notions. What is being valorized in this thinking? And then, of course, Nietzsche, who throws into question all of consciousness, and says we're essentially will to power, right? And then finally, of course, Freud, who really raises the question of desire. Yeah, and the masters of suspicion have no structural ego or structural Dasein either at work in some ways, right? It's really a question of just this movement, the movement machines, the mobility, right? Yeah. So, anyway. Yeah, so you're looking for something in the discourse on thinking? I mean, that's good to reread alongside, if you will, of the section today, temporality and discourse, and as well as sections 30, let's see, give you, 35, 36, 37, those sections.
Yeah.
On those, right? 34 through 38. Yeah. But what do you have?
There was just a
sentence.
there where he was sort of saying like how all these different philosophers kind of thought, epochally for their epoch or something. There was like this. I mean, I can find the sentence. But.
Well, I talked to you a little bit about the epochal,
Yeah.
terms and
Yeah.
how one reads epochs in philosophy according to Heidegger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was just really strong. It just reminded me of what you were saying.
Okay. Good. Yeah. Well, that's the question. Again, another good question and a way to approach this is to read epochally. You just don't read Marx in terms of, he's only describing 19th century capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be able to take some of these concepts and use them today and elaborate them further. What does it mean to extract surplus value today? What does that really mean? What is the value that is, being extracted, right? Number one, and then what is surplus? What does that really mean? And how do you produce surplus value? Yeah. What does that mean? Yeah. So I think these are very good talks, and also the excess that is talked about in some of the other literature, more of the George Bataille on visions of excess, these kind of things too. Yeah. There's always an excess and a remainder beyond the trace. And this is where the forgetfulness and the act of forgetting is happening, right? Is in that excess and that, over if you will, that attempt at overcoming. So Übermensch can be interpreted in many ways. It can refer to figures like a Junger or a Schoenberg or a Picasso or whatever in that regard too. It also can be the overcoming of man, the Mensch, right? The everydayness of the man, right? The overcoming of that. Also can be related to the force, the overcoming of forces in which built the quote the Mensch, right? The overcoming, because Uber is both towards and over. What does that mean to be over man, right? Is Nietzsche in a way hinting towards, quote, the eve of the future? Is this the most radical of feminisms in a certain way too? Just questions I'm throwing out. I'm not saying these are, absolute propositions, but, as I said, Heidegger, this is the feminization of consciousness in many ways. This is really about this world is feminine in German. Yeah. This is not a masculinist tendency, if you will, in psychoanalytic terms. Yeah. So, might be Heil Leni Riefenstahl, not Heil Hitler. Right? Anyway, I'm sorry. We've got playing now. Yeah, in a way, yeah. So any other, I think this is a great addition. You've got great vocabulary here too to work with. You have a whole section on submission that we never didn't really go to. For Heidegger, it's not a bad term, the submission, right? Because the submission is to a kind of authenticity, etc. This is also happening. Abandon, to be abandoned is not the worst thing either, or having an abandonment to something. Remember in the word abandonment, you have ban. You're going away from the restrictive, from the, it's interesting. Yeah, begin to think this through, on a different level. Yeah? And the words we use. And how words have become very bureaucratized, right? The book you guys like, The Function of a Cliche, and, modernity. We have this bureaucratization of language. People don't know what they're saying. What actually is coming down? How this language happens. What does it mean to hook up? What kind of language is this? To hook up, right? We're gonna hook up, huh? Anyway, yeah. So, You have some other thoughts, and then we can finish early today. I mean, I don't know if it's really early, but
I don't know. I can read the
But-
section that I like.
yeah, please, yeah,
It
by all
says-
means. Yeah.
He's talking about the
And this is
epochs.
from Discourse on the Language, or what?
This is on page 9.
Of what?
Time and
What
being.
text? Oh, Time and Being. I have a copy too. Yeah. Where are you? You're in the beginning.
On page
Yeah.
9, it's right.
By the
after-
way, I'll preface this. Hold on for a second,
Sure.
Josh, since we have a few minutes. Heidegger goes through a turn, after the war. It's called the Kehre, right? In which he begins to not think being as time, but time as being, right? So this is why time after time. Another reason for the title I used for this seminar course or whatever. So keep this in mind that this is written 1962. It's as I mentioned as well. It's a combination. It's a continuation of Being in Time, part of the unfinished project of the beginning, the announced moment alongside Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, 1929. This is a 1962 lecture that begins with a reflection both on Heisenberg and Paul Klee.
Yeah.
So the principle of indeterminacy and Saints from a Window and Death and Fire. A reflection on this. So keep this in mind that he goes through this radical, if you will, turning, right? In terms of where no longer you're using languages of authenticity and inauthenticity, or language of only etymological significance. He'll use language as the house of being. And one good starting point for this turn, and we're going to certainly do this when we do Marx, the letter on humanism, 1947. Is really the turning. I don't think you came, but Phil, you were there, right? We did a letter on humanism about 2-3 years ago, and a course on phenomenology, and you don't remember?
We
You
did
remember?
did
French
it.
post-structuralism.
Yeah, we did it.
We did it in post-structuralism
Yeah.
too. Okay,
Maybe.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure we did.
Okay. Anyway, very, very important text,
Yeah.
right? Because this is the beginning of the turn, 47.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it's anti-humanistic.
Yeah.
This is another thing too.
This book.
Most of the Marxism out there is humanistic as can be, and this is where I mean he's not here right now, but we could talk about this at greater length. The politics of victimhood is
humanism,
sitting duck
sure,
for
yeah.
humanistic Marxism. I mean
Yeah.
in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah. It's confusing how that came back around. Like, how is it? I mean, I thought
I've
we
never
killed it.
seen anything like it. Yeah.
What, the humanistic victim?
And you don't
Yeah,
get this
well-
in Canada. I mean, I
well,
don't get
with
this
all
in
of
Montreal.
post-structuralism,
Maybe it's just the people I hang with. there
Picking
that-
apart humanism, right?
Yeah.
And then for decades, it seems like, and then all of a sudden, victimhood comes back, humanism
Right.
comes back.
Both
as-
are coming
as
back
a
in
politics
different
is
ways
viable.
as a politics. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Which doesn't make sense to me. I don't get it.
Right.
Well, there's, I don't know, in terms of like the world, political world out there, I mean, you've got sort of the domination of the state of Israel in U.S. politics, and which is primarily based on victim.
Phil, I was astonished to learn this week that the U.S. oil companies are selling North Korea oil. I mean, I was shocked to learn of this completely. That these U.S. oil companies like Exxon Mobil are actually selling oil to the North
must-
Koreans. I thought there were sanctions.
Yeah, that must be why T-Rex got fired.
Yeah, T-Rex. I like that, T-Rex. Yeah, he's better than what replaced him.
Oh yeah.
Did you read Raymond's poem? Did you guys get
I
Raymond's
got it. I
poem?
didn't read it yet.
Oh, it's great. The
Is
Last
it?
Days of Pompeo.
Oh my
It's
God.
very funny. You on the list? I'll put you on the list for
So
Raymond. He's
funny.
great.
Yeah,
I'm
he
on it,
is.
but I
The
don't
Black
know
Agenda.
Josh's.
It's fantastic. I mean, it's a great
Yeah.
poem. The Last Days of Pompeo.
Yeah.
Raymond,
Yeah,
Raymond's
it is.
good. I want to see Raymond. Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, he is.
He sends it to Dixon and then the group. Sends it to the Black Agenda
Yeah.
report.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's great, huh? The Last Days of
Yeah.
Pompeo.
That's hilarious.
So, Josh, we're waiting on you to read.
sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm just
Page
teasing.
9.
I'm just teaching. Page 9 in the hardbound, too?
I don't know.
The history of being means destiny?
Yeah, this is just where he's talking about
Yeah.
epoch.
He actually speaks
Epoche.
to a level about fate. And, you know, there's a very Greek notion here at work that one does not do one's authentic if one does not reach one's destiny. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, it was more just this section at the bottom. He says he's kind of saying that you can only think being in terms of the epoche, right? And
Yes.
so he says when Plato represents being as an idea and as the koinonia of ideas, when Aristotle represents it as energia, Kant as position, Hegel as the absolute concept, Nietzsche as the will to power, these are not doctrines advanced by chance, but rather words of being as answers to a claim which speaks in the sending, concealing itself in the there is, it gives being.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to put up the German term because this is important too. And Danny Dye has a beautiful book called The Gift of Death.
Mm-hmm.
It
Gives, yeah.
That's the gift.
I just think it was like
Yeah.
an interesting section to sort of point to how these different, I guess, epoches conceive of being and how maybe
Right.
ours can't even conceive of the Heideggerian being anymore in this sort of advanced digital era or something, you know. As a,
Well, he called it the cybernetic era.
Right,
He was very
exactly.
frightened by
Yeah.
it. But he thought the possibility that technology, ultimately, the great danger is that it will ultimately maybe unconceal its liberatory potential.
exactly, yeah.
You know, but so far, we've gotten, 2 atom bombs dropped, right?
Mhm.
Consistent warfare. I mean, look what technology has done,
Mhm.
to us, in a way. I mean, of course, yes, it helps. You have,
Sure.
certain, positive
Maybe, yeah.
aspects. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
I mean, it's a pharmacon, I guess.
yes, it is part of the pharmacon, yeah. Yeah, but I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
But he thought this was the age of cybernetics.
Yeah.
This is why he also said the end of philosophy, too.
Mhm.
We've entered the age of cybernetics. We're no longer in the epoch of self-consciousness.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done this, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the 3 levels of the epoch of consciousness. The first was the philosophy of the one,
Mhm.
right? Going back to the one energy. I mean, he's talking
Yeah,
about this.
yeah, he just traces it
in a
really
way, traces
quickly,
it
yeah.
back,
Yeah.
very quickly. And then, of course, the Roman through the Middle Ages was the thinking of nature, natura. And then our epoch is really constituted by the inauguration of the Cartesian subject, the I am that thinks, and, the self-consciousness in Hegel. And it ends, and Western metaphysics has a long trajectory from Plato to Nietzsche. And this is the destiny of the West,
Yeah.
Ultimately in its metaphysical trajectory. And this is how we've been, framed, inframed, ensnared. Another even very crucial talk, we're ensnared.
Mhm.
In a certain way. Yeah. So it's good. No, this is a great section. I mean, at the beginning, I like this too, because this gives you an idea that for history of him, at the top of page 9, the history of being means destiny of being, in whose sendings, both the sending and the it, the S, the it, which sends forth, hold back with their self-manifestation. To hold back or to withdraw, in Greek, is epoche,
Yeah.
to hold back.
That's interesting.
To suspend judgment, to hold back, to withdraw. Right? Hence we speak of the epochs of the destiny of being. What's being held back? Epoch does not mean here a span of time in occurrence, but rather the fundamental characteristic of the sending. Right? Very important. The fundamental characteristic, not just we're dating the end of, the Middle Ages with the discovery of the Americas in 1492, or the advent of, slavery with the transatlantic slave. The dating is not important here at all. In this way, right?
And maybe
Yeah.
that way we can participate in other epoches of being in a way, right?
Well, we begin to participate in a
Stretch them
sense.
along,
Yeah.
the repetition.
Exactly, in the
Yeah.
stretches of time.
Right.
Yeah. So this is very important. But rather the fundamental of sending, the actual holding back of itself in favor of the discernibility of the gift, that is, of being with regard to the grounding of beings. And going back to the ontological, the being, right, in regard to the ontic beings. The Sein and the Sein des. The Sein des belong to the ontic, because the ontic is going modifications, right, in this sending. right?
Mm-hmm.
In its everydayness. The sequence of epochs in the destiny of being is not accidental, nor can it be calculated as necessary. Still, what is appropriate shows itself in the destiny. What is appropriate shows itself in the belonging together of the epochs. The epochs overlap each other in their sequence so that the original sense of being, its presence, is more and more obscured, right? This is, we get obscured. We don't really understand self-consciousness, in terms of its original sending. What happened?
Yeah.
Where was that break? That rupture again, if you will, and how this happened in this epoch. And now how are we on the cusp of losing self-consciousness, losing selfhood and care into a new cyber,
Right.
navigational consciousness rather than, something of which, we have,
Navigation.
the new gift, right, in a sense. And I love this beginning here. I think this is something we should think about every day. He has a very beautiful beginning here. Let me give a little hint on how to listen. This is on page 2. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of the showing.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful
It's
to me.
poetry.
That's really a poetic statement, right? Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing. And I'm beginning to learn. I'm thinking through piano much these days. But anyway, I'm beginning to learn. It's really the spacing and the silences between the keys where the real activity is. How it's being held. It's not just the note themselves. Right? It's very interesting to me. To begin to see this in a more philosophical way. Yeah. And being means the same as presencing. So he gives definitions here, and this is where a lot of the philosophers that took up Heidegger began to talk about Anwesen, presence and presencing, and the movement of presence and absence in history. And where Derrida would go, against, there's no such thing against us full presence.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Right?
It's
The thing's time.
it's a tricky thing to think about, but
Yes, it is. Yes, right. So this is a beautiful essay.
Yeah.
This book also has the end of philosophy and the task of thinking at the end. Yeah. And its way to phenomenology. It has a lot of very good things, right?
yeah, it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great book. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I like too that in the first few pages of this, he says, he can abandon any claim that it should be immediately intelligible. And he
You mean
talks
for
about
Heisenberg?
Heisenberg?
Yeah. Werner.
If you would sit down in these lectures, you would understand nothing.
None of us in this auditorium can understand anything of Heisenberg. Yeah. Yeah.
So why should you think any different of
Heisenberg
philosophy?
wrote a very good
Yeah.
text on the Greek's notion of nature, on physis. Yeah, yeah. Andrei Zavitsis had my copy for 20 years, and then on the strike line one day he comes up, I've had this book of yours for so long, and he talks with very low voice. I've had this book of yours for so long, I wanted to give it back. Right. Yeah. I had forgotten it in my office. I said, that's great. I'm going to reread it. Thank you. Right.
Amazing.
Yeah. No, it's this is worthy of a lot of again attention and thinking through. Listen, you're not going to get direct political action, but you can actually think through. Where is really movement politics through a lot of these things? How are you going to ultimately kind of overcome the old staleness, etc. Right? What does this mean? Right? How do you avoid repetition time after time? Right?
Yeah.
In a sense, how will there be repetition in the bad sense of this? What happened in West Virginia with the teacher strike? Is this going to just play out in the worst of hands? Is the AFT going to get their teeth into this? That's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't jump right into it immediately because they.
Well, they want contracts.
Right.
I'm against contracts.
Mm-hmm.
Contract unionism kills.
Well, it moves into business unionism.
It moves into what? I'm sorry?
Business unionism.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And business unionism is the death of unionism.
Yes, indeed. Worse than Gomperism.
Yeah.
At least Gomper's at the table, I want more.
Right.
You know the famous story, he goes to the senators, he goes before a Senate committee, and they ask him, Mr. Gompers, what do you want? You know, starts pounding it down, I want more and more and more. And the senators, that's exactly what we want. And that was the beginning of the obvious collaboration between management and labor.
Yeah. Man.
Right.
So should we continue reading this chapter for next week, or?
You can continue to read it, but I think I'm going to sum up too.
Just
Yeah, I
gonna
would
go
read,
over
read
everything.
more. Yeah, you can read the entire chapter. Yeah, you should read the entire chapter. Yeah. I didn't want to burden people too much, you know. And
No.
it's very dense. And I mean, look, my hope for you, I mean, for myself as well, is that we can go back to this at our leisure and, you know, our various temporalities and everyday responsibilities and reread this in a very different light, you know, after this is just the quote first encounter for, I think, for most people here. So, you know, the second and the third, you know, as Derrida once said, the text hides from the first comer. So you need the second coming, I'm sorry to be so, anyway. Double entre. But anyway, it's kind of like that, you know. So
Well,
I mean, you know, that's the thing. You know, if you start rereading sections of it, it's going to be much clearer, and it's going to really help in terms of, I think, giving your mind, I mean, you know, a much greater structure to work with in terms of the, you know, the rest of the stuff we got to do, you know?
Yeah.
Because this is one of the best, and it's one of the most difficult, you know? So, you know, we're not taking on small, as Stanley likes to say, small potatoes.
No, this is great.
Right.
How's Stanley doing?
He's better, actually, yeah. I mean, he had a little bit of a regression. He had to go to the hospital. I think I told you, right? Yeah, he's out of that, and now he seems to be off the antibiotics. His appetite's returned. He's speaking much better. He's much clearer. You know, kind of jovial to a degree. You know, I think he's very worried about, you know, how much care he needs and, you know, the whole bit, and, you know. And I mean, I really wish he would just get a dictaphone or something and just put his thoughts into, you know, verbally. You know, he's not going to be able to write. And, you know, this has been taken away. And it's very sad, you know, in a certain way. This has been Stanley's life. You know, likes to sit, write, and talk, and, you know, be out there, right? And, you know, he can't get out there as much. And, again, you know, writing was always a major thing for him. Yeah,
But he won't dictate?
I don't know what it is. I don't know if he doesn't have the energy or if what's really going on. I may try to broach that with him, you know. But I think he's got an underlying depression that he doesn't want to face. But, you know, I mean, how could he not be somewhat depressed? This is 2.5 years into a stroke. You know.
Yeah.
I mean, this is 30 months since it happened. Beginning next month.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of people get rage. You know.
Right. Well, I had a good friend, I think I told you, a polio victim. He got polio when he was 17, about 1.5 years before the vaccine came out in the 50s. And he, you know, he was paralyzed. And then he was in a car accident where he broke his neck and had no movement of his neck at all. He had in his brain, and he had his feet. He had feeling in his feet. He taught himself how to use a computer keyboard with his feet. And he became one of the most successful. This was a very good friend of mine. He became very successful as a stock market trader. You know, big time. Yeah. And I mean, it goes to show you never would know he ever had, you know, any kind of disability. I mean, talking to him personally. Yeah. So I mean, there are people who, you know, in some ways just love life or want to live. You know, that will is so strong. You know, and I mean, to me, he was exemplary in terms of anticipatory resoluteness. I mean, you know, I know that he, you know, he used to tell me, I've seen things normal people don't see. I can imagine, you know, go into an iron lung at night. You know, this guy's life against death every minute. You know, he lived to be about 62, 63 years old. You know, I mean, well beyond his group. There was, like, I think 49, 50 the group of polio victims, they track this, obviously, this medical positivism. Yeah. There's a major, yeah. We used to talk every day. Character, yeah. Great about stuff, yeah. And actually had a fairly normal life, built himself a house to specification. I mean, he didn't do it physically, but he sat with the architect and had money, obviously, yeah.
Well, you look at Stephen Hawking.
That's another one, yeah. And I mean, there are people out there, in many ways. So yeah. So the politics of victimhood is not a good politics to me. I mean, to be honest, what I've seen and known, yeah. I mean, there are victims, of course, and it's good to be angry and indignant in a sense. But if you only live there, it'll consume you, and it consumes the movement. I mean, I've learned this, in some ways the hard way, But yeah.
Yeah, things do seem kind of paralyzed.
What's that? I'm sorry?
I said things do seem kind of paralyzed.
They are, yeah. I think the part of the trajectory now, or part of the fundamental political project, is to understand how paralyzed it got. Why did that happen? And then, of course, what do you undo? I don't think we have a choice but revolution. I mean, I don't think that, unless you're thinking revolutionary consciousness, you're dead out here. I mean, spiritually, you're dead. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, not biologically.
I think so.
Yeah, unless you're thinking. I mean, reformism, all this stuff, these little piecemeal stuff, the left wing of the Democratic Party, or this little group, the Social Democrats, the DSA, or the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, all these groups out there. To me, this is, not the way. Too much reformist tendencies. Yeah. And, it takes a complete stepping outside of where we've been in a certain way, too, because we're conditioned in a certain way to see, it was the Reagan-Thatcher program, neoliberalism. It did it to us completely. Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, of course, yeah. But, yeah.
Well, neoliberalism.
Reagan was a midget. Where was the fight?
Yeah.
A midget. These are midget minds. Look at who's in the White House now. Kudlow, another midget mind. The worst. He came on to me once. Yeah. I was at the Monkey Bar in Midtown.
Apparently, I can't stand watching him, but apparently his prognosis hasn't been very good. I mean, it's been pretty bad from what I understand.
No, he's terrible as an economist.
Yeah,
terrible.
Terrible.
No, he's the tax man. That's all. Make the corporations richer. That's his mantra.
What do you think this crazy man Kramer that's on TV? Is he another?
Another crazy brother. He didn't come on. He gave me a nasty look on Wall Street once. I was walking with DeFazio. DeFazio said, "That's Jim Kramer." And I said, "He's been wrong on every market." I got this look. Yeah, he's another madman that made a fortune. This is all this MSNBC, crowd that not MSN, CNBC, Cable News Business Network or some bullshit like that. Yeah. They all come out of this thing. This was created, Bloomberg, and then this business channel. These are the two dominant channels. We'll do this at Rachel's house. We'll go through all the ideological apparatuses that are involved in finance capital. Yeah. But anyway, no, he's bad, God love. Yeah. He's bad, man. Yeah. Little short guy. He's about 5'1". Yeah. Like Reich. He's the Reich's Robert Reich.
Reich,
yeah. Larry Kudlow. Yeah. The Reich's Reich.
Yeah, Reich's a trip too.
Yeah, another one. Well,